Somewhere in the Italian countryside, a lake sits in the crater of an ancient volcano. And at the bottom of that lake, two Roman palaces have been resting in the dark for nearly 2,000 years. In the highlands of a country most people could not place on a map, thousands of stone structures built by a culture that vanished without explanation stretch across the landscape as far as the eye can see. Deep in a cave system on the other side of the world, paintings older than anything we have a name for cover the walls. The ancient world was a busy place. People were building, carving, burying, sailing, and creating on every continent across thousands of years, and in ways that still catch us off guard when we find the evidence. Tonight, I have 20 of those discoveries for you. Some of what I'll cover will be familiar in outline, but stranger in its detail than you might expect. And some of it you will not have heard of at all. Either way, none of it has a clean answer attached. And as always with our deep dives, the visuals are just there for context, and you do not need to watch closely to follow along. This is the kind of video that works just as well in the background, so whether you are winding down for the night, making yourself a drink, or just looking for something to have on, you are in the right place. Get comfortable, settle in, and let's get into it. In the mountains of the American Southeast, there is a story that the Cherokee have been telling for a very long time. It describes a people who lived in the Appalachian region before the Cherokee arrived, a group known as the Moon-Eyed people. According to the accounts, they were pale-skinned and large-eyed, so sensitive to light that they could only move around at night. They built stone structures across the mountain landscape, and at some point, the Cherokee drove them out. The earliest written record of the story comes from 1795 in an account by Benjamin Hawkins, a U.S. government agent who spent years living among the Cherokee and carefully documented their oral traditions. Hawkins described the Moon-Eyed people as an established part of Cherokee historical memory, something passed down across generations rather than a recent addition to their storytelling. Other observers over the following decades recorded the same account with the same consistent details: pale skin, oversized eyes, nocturnal habits, stone construction. The description did not shift or vary much between sources, which is usually a sign that an oral tradition is preserving something specific rather than drifting into general myth. The Cherokee themselves had been living in the southern Appalachians for centuries before European contact, with their territory covering a vast area across what are now the states of North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. They were a sophisticated and politically organized people with a complex clan system, established trade networks, and a detailed oral history that recorded their relationships with the landscape and with the peoples they had encountered or displaced over time. The Moon-Eyed people account sits within that broader historical tradition, treated not as mythology, but as a record of something that actually happened in the region before the Cherokee became the dominant culture there. The stone structures the Cherokee associated with the Moon-Eyed people are still there. The Fort Mountain Wall in Georgia runs roughly 270 meters along the crest of a ridge in the Blue Ridge Range, built from stacked stones in a clear and deliberate line. At regular intervals along the wall, there are shallow pits whose function has never been worked out. Some researchers have suggested the pits served as defensive positions, others have proposed they were used for fire or signaling, and others have argued they are simply natural depressions in the rock that were incorporated into the wall's design. None of these explanations has been confirmed. The wall does not match the building traditions of any known Native American culture in the southeastern United States. The typical construction in this region was mound-based, not wall-based, and Fort Mountain sits outside that pattern entirely. Direct dating of the wall has been attempted several times and produced conflicting results, leaving the question of when it was built without a clean answer. In Jackson County, North Carolina, the Ggantija rock is a large soapstone boulder covered in hundreds of carved figures, lines, handprints, geometric shapes, and animal forms. The carvings cover almost the entire surface and clearly represent a significant investment of time by whoever made them. Cherokee tradition connects the rock to a being called Ggantija, described as a giant slant-eyed creature who owned all the game animals in the mountains and who was said to have leapt from a nearby peak and left his handprint in the stone on landing. Whether the carvings predate Cherokee occupation of the area or were made by Cherokee artists has never been conclusively established. A detailed survey by researchers from Western Carolina University documented over 100 individual carved elements, but could not determine who made them or when. The soapstone itself cannot be directly dated, and no organic material associated with the carving process has been recovered that would allow radiocarbon dating. The Southern Appalachians sit within a region that was densely occupied by a succession of cultures going back thousands of years before the Cherokee. The Woodland period cultures, active from roughly 1000 BC to 1000 AD, built earthworks and ceremonial sites across the eastern United States, including parts of the Appalachian region. Before them, the Archaic period cultures, dating back as far as 8000 BC, left evidence of sustained occupation across the same landscape. Whether any of these earlier cultures built the structures now associated with the Moon-Eyed people, or whether the structures represent an entirely separate and unidentified tradition, has never been established. The Moon-Eyed people description attracted a lot of theorizing from European and American scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries. The most persistent theory connected the story to a Welsh prince named Madoc, who, according to legend, sailed west across the Atlantic in 1170 AD and established a colony somewhere in the Americas. Proponents argued that the Moon-Eyed people were descendants of these Welsh settlers, and some claim to have found Welsh linguistic traces in the languages of certain Native American groups. The theory was investigated seriously and found no supporting evidence. There is no credible archaeological or genetic trace of pre-Columbian Welsh settlement anywhere in North America, and the linguistic arguments fell apart under scrutiny. The Madoc connection is not taken seriously by mainstream researchers, though it keeps turning up in popular history writing. What makes the Moon-Eyed people genuinely interesting, once the Madoc theory is set aside, is the basic situation. The Cherokee maintained a detailed and consistent oral account of a people who came before them in the Southern Appalachians, who had specific and unusual physical traits, and who left stone structures behind. The Southern Appalachians contain stone structures that predate known Cherokee occupation, and that do not match any other identified culture's building tradition in the region. The Cherokee were not known for inventing elaborate historical stories about their predecessors, and the specificity of the Moon-Eyed people description, the nocturnal habits, the large eyes, the stone construction, goes beyond the kind of vague predecessor story that turns up in many cultures' traditions. The Southern Appalachians are significantly underexplored by archaeological standards. The terrain is difficult, funding for survey work has been limited, and large areas of the mountain landscape have never been formally investigated. A number of stone structures, similar in character to the Fort Mountain Wall, have been identified across the region without being properly studied. Whether any of these represent the remains of a pre-Cherokee building tradition connected to the people the Cherokee described is a question that has not been seriously pursued with modern archaeological methods. The broader question of who was living in the Southern Appalachians in the centuries before the Cherokee consolidated their presence there is not well understood. The Mississippian culture, which dominated much of the southeastern United States from around 800 to 1600 AD, left extensive earthwork sites across the lowland areas of the region, but is not associated with the kind of stone wall construction seen at Fort Mountain. The relationship between the Mississippian people, the Cherokee, and whatever earlier groups may have occupied the mountain zones is an area where the archaeological record is genuinely thin. One detail worth noting is that the Museum of the Cherokee Indian in Cherokee, North Carolina, displays a carved wooden figure known as the Welsh Indian, a folk art piece depicting a figure with wide eyes that some have connected to the Moon-Eyed people tradition. The figure is not ancient, but its presence in the museum reflects how seriously the Cherokee themselves have taken this part of their oral history, enough to preserve and display a physical representation of it. The tradition is not treated as embarrassing folklore by the community that carries it. It is presented as a genuine part of their historical account of the region, sitting alongside other documented elements of Cherokee history and culture. Long before the pyramids, Long before the first cities rose along the banks of the Nile, a culture was already flourishing in Mesopotamia that would eventually lay the groundwork for everything we think of as the ancient world. The Ubaid people lived across what is now Iraq and the surrounding region from roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BC, making them one of the earliest complex societies in the ancient Near East. They built temples, developed irrigation systems, traded across long distances, and created a social structure sophisticated enough that the Sumerian civilization, the world's first truly urban society, grew directly out of what the Ubaid left behind. They also made figurines that nobody has been able to explain. Among the thousands of clay objects recovered from Ubaid sites over the past century, a specific type keeps appearing: humanoid figures with elongated heads, pointed faces, almond-shaped eyes, and skin that looks scaled or textured. Some stand upright holding staffs or other objects. Some sit in positions that suggest authority or ceremony. Some are clearly female, and a number of them appear to be nursing infants. They come in male and female forms and have been found at multiple sites across a wide area, including Tel Es-Sawan and Ur, two of the most extensively excavated Ubaid locations. The figures have been turning up since the early 20th century and studied ever since. What they represent is still an open question. The first thing worth understanding about these figurines is that the reptilian features are not subtle or accidental. This is not a case of rough craftsmanship that could be read different ways. The elongated skulls, the narrow pointed faces, the textured skin, and the distinctive eye shape are consistent across figures found at different sites, made at different times, spread across hundreds of miles. Whatever the Ubaid people were depicting, they were depicting it deliberately and consistently over a very long period. The Ubaid culture sits at a fascinating moment in human history. The period from roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BC in Mesopotamia was one of the most transformative in the ancient Near East. Farming communities were expanding, trade networks were growing, social hierarchies were developing, and the first proto-urban centers were beginning to appear. The Ubaid people were part of that shift, and their cultural practices fed directly into what Sumer eventually became. By the time writing was invented and the Sumerians began leaving records, the Ubaid were already ancient history, but the temples they built, the gods they worshipped, and the social patterns they established had shaped the world the Sumerians inherited. The mainstream reading of the lizard figures is that they represent deities or supernatural beings of some kind, possibly connected to a religious tradition that did not survive in recognizable form into the later Sumerian period. Giving gods human bodies with non-human features was a common practice across ancient Near Eastern cultures, and the Ubaid figures fit broadly within that pattern. Sumerian mythology eventually filled the world with gods who were essentially giant humans, but the earlier religious traditions they drew on may have been considerably stranger, and the lizard figures may be a glimpse of that older belief system. Where this interpretation runs into difficulty is in the details. The reptilian features of the Ubaid figures are not the kind of stylized animal attributes that appear in later Mesopotamian art, where a deity might be shown with a lion's head or a bird's wings as a clear symbolic marker. The Ubaid figures look like a coherent physical type, consistent enough in their features that they read more like representations of a specific kind of being than a symbolic artistic shorthand, and the domestic context of some of the figures, particularly those showing what appear to be mothers nursing infants, sits oddly with a purely religious reading. Deity figures tend to turn up in temples and ceremonial deposits. Nursing mother figures turn up in homes. The Ubaid lizard figures appear in both settings. A comprehensive study of Ubaid figurines, published in the journal Iraq, cataloged every known example from across the major sites. The researchers found that the reptilian figures were not limited to one location or one short period. They were turning up consistently across a wide area over a long stretch of time, which rules out the idea that this was some local quirk or one-off artistic trend. The study confirmed the figures were a genuine and sustained feature of Ubaid culture. It did not offer a definitive answer for what they meant, and the authors were clear about the limits of what the evidence allows. There is also the question of what came before and after. The lizard figure tradition does not have a clear precursor in the region. Earlier, Neolithic cultures in the Near East produced figurines, but the specific reptilian type, associated with the Ubaid, appears without an obvious buildup leading to it. And after the Ubaid period ends and Sumerian civilization begins to take shape, the lizard figures simply stop. Later Mesopotamian art is extraordinarily rich and varied, but it does not continue or develop the reptilian humanoid tradition in any recognizable way. The figures appear, persist for around 2,000 years, and then disappear without leaving a clear trace in what came after. The site of Tel Es-Sawan in central Iraq is one of the most important locations for understanding the Ubaid figurine tradition. Excavations there uncovered a large number of the lizard-type figures, alongside evidence of a well-organized and economically active community. The people living at Tel Es-Sawan were importing materials from hundreds of miles away and producing goods worth trading across long distances. They were connected to a broader ancient world, participating in networks that stretched far beyond their immediate landscape. The people making the lizard figures were not isolated or simple. They were part of a complex and active society, which makes the complete disappearance of this figurine tradition from the later record even harder to account for. Some researchers have proposed that the figures represent a priestly or elite class within Ubaid society. People who wore masks or costumes with reptilian features during religious ceremonies, and that the figurines are depictions of those ritual performers rather than supernatural beings. This keeps the figures within the range of known human behavior, but it does not explain why the tradition was so consistent across so many different locations, or why it stopped so cleanly when it did. Others have pointed to serpent symbolism in later Mesopotamian mythology, where the snake and the dragon are tied to primordial forces and divine power, and suggested the Ubaid figures are an earlier expression of the same tradition. But the visual connection between the Ubaid figures and later Mesopotamian serpent imagery is not strong enough to build a confident case on. One detail that tends to get overlooked in discussions of the Ubaid figures is the nursing mother examples. A figure of a reptilian humanoid nursing an infant is not what you would expect from a purely religious or ceremonial tradition. It suggests something more domestic, more embedded in everyday life. Whether that means the figures represented beings that the Ubaid people believed existed alongside them in some way, or whether it reflects something about how they understood the relationship between the human and the divine, is not something the current evidence can answer. But it is a detail that makes the purely ritual interpretation harder to settle on comfortably. What the Ubaid lizard figures leave behind is a very specific and unresolved puzzle. A culture that laid the foundation for the ancient world spent around 2,000 years consistently depicting a type of being that does not match any known religious or artistic tradition before or after them. The figures are numerous, they are consistent across a huge geographic area and time span, and they have been studied for over a century without producing an agreed answer to the most basic question. What exactly were the Ubaid people depicting, and why did they stop? In June 1992, a farmer named Wu Anai was standing next to a pond in Xi'an Beikun village in Zhejiang province, eastern China, trying to work out why it never seemed to drain. Local people had always assumed it was just a natural depression in the ground that filled with water. Wu Anai had a different theory, and he decided to test it by renting a water pump and seeing what was actually at the bottom. It took 17 days of continuous pumping to find out. When the water level finally dropped enough to see what was underneath, Wu Anai was not looking at the bottom of a pond. He was looking at the entrance to an enormous underground cavern, carved entirely by hand from solid sandstone. Further investigation over the following weeks revealed that this was not a single cave. There were 24 of them, spread across the hillside, covering a total area of approximately 30,000 square meters, roughly the equivalent of 5 full-sized football pitches of underground space. All hand-carved, all connected, and all completely unknown to the modern world until a farmer with a water pump decided to find out what was at the bottom of his pond. Stepping inside the caves is a striking experience by any account. The ceilings rise up to 30 meters in places, giving the larger chambers a scale that feels more like a cathedral than anything you would expect to find carved into a hillside in rural China. Every wall and ceiling surface is covered in a pattern of chisel marks, parallel lines cut at a 45-degree angle, running across every surface in the same direction with a consistency that is immediately obvious. Stone columns have been left standing at regular intervals to hold up the roof. There are what appear to be rooms and corridors, fish ponds, stone bridges, and pools. The caves are not rough or improvised. They are carefully designed spaces built to a clear plan, and there is no record of them anywhere. China has one of the most detailed historical record-keeping traditions in the world. Imperial archives, local chronicles, and administrative records going back thousands of years document construction projects, military campaigns, and even routine agricultural activity in remarkable detail. The Qin and Han dynasties, the periods researchers think most likely produced the caves based on the style of the chisel work, were particularly well-documented eras in Chinese history. The Great Wall, the Terracotta Army, major canals and road networks, all of it is in the records. The Longyou Caves, which required removing an estimated 1 million cubic meters of rock, appear in none of it, not in local records, not in imperial archives, not in any historical text that anyone has been able to find. No tools were left inside, no inscriptions on the walls, no human remains, no artifacts of any kind that might point to who was there or when. The caves were walked into for the first time in what appears to have been many centuries, and they gave nothing away. The sheer scale of what was carved there is worth thinking about. 1 million cubic meters of rock, removed by hand, using tools that left marks roughly a centimeter wide. That rock had to go somewhere, and researchers have found no obvious spoil heap anywhere in the surrounding landscape. Some have suggested the stone was used as building material elsewhere, which would at least explain its absence. But no local construction has been identified that could account for that volume. Where it went is one of several things about the Longyou Caves that simply has no answer. The chisel mark pattern is one of the most discussed features. Across all 24 chambers, covering 30,000 square meters of wall and ceiling, the marks run in the same direction at the same angle. Keeping that consistency across a project this size means every worker involved was following the same technical standard throughout. That level of coordination points to a well-organized workforce operating under clear direction, not a casual or informal effort. Chinese and Japanese researchers who have looked at the structural detail of the caves have confirmed the pattern is consistent throughout and that the caves are entirely artificial, but they have not been able to work out how old they are or what they were built for. Dating the caves has proven just as difficult as explaining them. The chisel work looks broadly consistent with techniques from the Qin or Han dynasty periods, so researchers have placed the construction somewhere around 2,000 years ago. But that is based on comparison with other known sites, not direct evidence. No organic material has been found inside that could be carbon dated, and the sandstone itself cannot be dated directly. The 2,000-year figure is an educated guess, not a confirmed date. Several theories have been put forward for what the caves were actually used for. Underground storage for grain or other goods is one of the more practical suggestions, and storing materials underground was a known practice in ancient China. Military use is another, with the cave network possibly serving as a barracks, supply base, or refuge during a period of conflict. Ritual or ceremonial spaces have also been proposed, based on how deliberate and careful the construction clearly was. Some researchers have suggested the caves were a quarrying operation, with the extracted stone being the whole point, and the caves themselves a byproduct. Others think the project may have been abandoned before it was finished, which might explain why nothing was left behind. None of these theories works cleanly. A grain storage facility does not obviously need fish ponds and stone bridges. A military installation would almost certainly appear somewhere in the historical record. A quarrying operation on this scale would leave a massive spoil heap. The caves do not fit neatly into any of the available explanations, which is a big part of what makes them so difficult to categorize. The village of Xianbeikun sits in a part of Zhejiang province that was historically active during the Qin and Han periods, in a region that saw considerable administrative and military movement during those dynasties. The area around the caves has not been comprehensively surveyed or excavated, and it is possible that connected surface features, access routes, settlement remains, tool storage areas exist somewhere nearby and simply have not been found yet. A more thorough survey of the surrounding landscape might produce answers, or it might just raise more questions. One detail that researchers keep coming back to is how the caves were sealed off in the first place. For the caves to have flooded and remained flooded long enough that an entire village forgot they existed, the original entrances must have been blocked or collapsed at some point after the caves were last used. Whether that happened deliberately or through natural processes over time is not known, but the result was that one of the largest hand-carved underground spaces in the world sat undiscovered for what may have been 2,000 years, hidden beneath a pond that everyone assumed was just a pond. Wu and I's discovery set off a wave of investigation that is still ongoing. The caves have been visited by researchers from China, Japan, and elsewhere, and various survey and analysis projects have been carried out over the years since 1992. The basic facts of the caves, their size, their construction quality, their internal features, their complete absence from the historical record have all been confirmed. What has not been confirmed is anything about who built them, when exactly they were built, or what they were for. 30 years of investigation have produced a clearer picture of the caves themselves, without producing any clearer picture of the people who made them. On the rock walls of the Kimberley region in northwestern Australia, there are figures that have been watching over the landscape for thousands of years. They are large, typically painted in white against red and ochre backgrounds, with big dark eyes, no mouths, and what appear to be halos or elaborate headdresses radiating out from their heads. They are called the Wandjina, and what makes them unlike almost anything else covered in this video is that the culture that created them is still here, still maintaining them, and still regards them as very much alive. The Kimberley is one of the most remote and least visited regions in Australia, a vast stretch of ancient landscape in the far northwest of the country, characterized by dramatic sandstone gorges, seasonal rivers, and rock formations that have been accumulating human artwork for tens of thousands of years. The rock art tradition of the Kimberley is one of the oldest and most varied in the world, with paintings spanning an extraordinary range of periods and styles. The Wandjina figures sit within that broader tradition, but stand apart from it, distinct in their appearance and in the continuous cultural relationship that surrounds them. According to the Mwanjim people and other Aboriginal groups of the Kimberley, the Wandjina are not simply paintings of ancient beings, they are the beings themselves. The Wandjina are creator figures who shaped the landscape, established the laws by which people live, and then transformed themselves into the images on the rock walls at the end of the creation period. They are not historical figures from a distant past. They are ongoing presences in the landscape, and the paintings are the form they currently inhabit. Allowing a Wandjina painting to fade or deteriorate is not simply neglect of cultural heritage. It is allowing a living presence to weaken. So the paintings are maintained, retouched, and renewed by the traditional custodians of each site, a practice that has been going on continuously for longer than most cultures on Earth have existed in recognizable form. This creates an unusual situation for researchers. The tradition of repainting means that individual Wandjina images may represent the accumulated work of many different hands across thousands of years, each generation refreshing the image on top of what came before. Establishing the age of any specific painting is therefore complicated, because what you are looking at may be a recent layer applied over a much older base. The oldest Wandjina-style figures that researchers have been able to date with any confidence appear to be around 4,000 years old, though some researchers have argued for earlier examples based on stylistic analysis. A study published in the journal Australian Archaeology in 2020 conducted new dating analysis of Kimberley rock art and confirmed the deep antiquity of the tradition while being clear that many questions about the oldest layers remain open. Whether the Wandjina tradition goes back further than 4,000 years, and if so, by how much, is something the current evidence cannot settle. The visual appearance of the Wandjina figures has attracted a great deal of attention from outside the communities that created them, and not all of it has been welcome. The large eyes, the absence of a mouth, and the halo-like headpiece give the figures a look that is unlike most other prehistoric art traditions anywhere in the world. And over the decades, various commentators and researchers from outside the Aboriginal community have proposed their own theories about what the Wandjina really are. Ancient astronaut theories have been particularly persistent, with some writers arguing that the figures depict visitors from space, pointing to the large eyes and the halo as evidence of helmets or spacesuits. Others have proposed connections to ancient civilizations from outside Australia, suggesting the figures reflect contact with Egyptian, Phoenician, or other cultures from the ancient world. The Mwandjam people and other Kimberley communities have been consistent and clear in their response to these theories. The Wandjina are their creation beings, their cultural and spiritual tradition, and outside interpretations that overlay the figures with unrelated frameworks are seen as a misrepresentation of something that is still a living and active part of their culture. The figures are not ancient aliens. They are not evidence of foreign contact. They are the Wandjina, and the people who have maintained a direct and unbroken relationship with them for thousands of years are the appropriate source of knowledge about what they are. That said, the archaeological questions about the Wandjina tradition are genuine and have not been fully answered. The Kimberley region contains an enormous number of rock art sites, many of which have never been formally documented. The full geographic extent of the Wandjina tradition across the region is not known with precision, and the relationship between the Wandjina figures and the other art styles found in the Kimberley, some of which are considerably older, has not been fully worked out. The oldest layers of rock art in the Kimberley include styles that predate the Wandjina tradition by tens of thousands of years, and understanding how the different artistic and cultural traditions of the region relate to each other over that enormous time span is a research challenge that is still very much in progress. The absence of a mouth on the Wandjina figures is one of the details that researchers and visitors tend to notice first. Within Mwandjam tradition, the explanation is that the Wandjina do not need to speak because their power operates through presence and through the rain and weather they control. The Wandjina are strongly associated with the wet season and with the storms that bring life to the Kimberley landscape. But from an outside perspective, the missing mouth is one of the most visually distinctive features of the figures and one of the things that makes them feel unlike other prehistoric art traditions. Combined with the large dark eyes and the radiating headdress, the overall effect is of a being that feels designed to be seen and recognized rather than simply decorative. The Kimberley itself gives some context for why this region produced such a sustained and distinctive artistic tradition. It is an ancient landscape in a very literal sense, with some of the oldest exposed rock formations on the planet, and a level of ecological diversity that supported human populations continuously for at least 50,000 years. The Aboriginal communities of the Kimberley developed cultural traditions across that enormous span of time that have no parallel elsewhere in terms of their depth and continuity. The Wandjina paintings are one expression of that continuity, a tradition that has been maintained across thousands of years through a direct and living cultural connection, rather than through archaeological recovery and reconstruction. Most ancient art traditions are things we look at from the outside, trying to reconstruct what they meant to the people who made them from physical evidence and context. The Wandjina are different. There are people alive today who can tell you directly what the figures are, what they mean, and why they are maintained, because that knowledge has been passed down in an unbroken line from the people who first painted them. That is an extraordinary thing in the context of ancient mysteries, and it makes the Wandjina simultaneously one of the better understood and one of the more genuinely complex entries on this list. While Australia was developing one of the world's most enduring artistic traditions, something very different was happening on the other side of the planet. In what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, a culture was building cities. Not villages, not small settlements, but genuine, large-scale, planned urban communities, thousands of years before most of the world was doing anything of the kind. The Cucuteni Trypillia culture was active from roughly 4,800 to 3,500 BC, during what archaeologists call the Copper Age in southeastern Europe. This was a period of growing social complexity across the region, with communities trading across long distances and developing increasingly sophisticated material culture. But the Cucuteni Trypillia people were doing something on a scale that stands out even against that broader backdrop of development. Their settlements ranged from small villages of a few dozen houses to enormous planned communities covering up to 320 hectares. The largest of these sites housed an estimated 10 to 15,000 people, which would have made them among the biggest human settlements anywhere on Earth at the time. For context, the early cities of Mesopotamia, the ones usually credited as the world's first urban centers, were developing at roughly the same period and on a comparable scale. The difference is that those Mesopotamian cities went on to become the foundation of recorded history. The Cucuteni Trypillia Megasites were forgotten so completely that their existence was not confirmed until the 20th century. The layout of the larger settlements is one of the things that makes them so striking. The houses were not scattered randomly across the landscape. They were arranged in precise concentric rings, row after row of large two-story structures circling around open central spaces that appear to have been used as communal areas. Streets ran between the rings, and at the center of each settlement there were larger buildings that researchers interpret as assembly spaces or communal halls. The planning involved in organizing a community of 10,000 people into this kind of structured layout is not simple. It requires coordination, agreed rules, and some form of authority capable of directing construction across the whole site. LiDAR surveys of Trypillia megasites published in the journal PLOS 1 in 2020 revealed the full internal layout of several sites for the first time, and the results confirmed just how deliberate and carefully organized the settlements were. The circular planning was not approximate. It was precise, consistent, across sites separated by significant distances, and maintained across the 300 years or so during which the megasite tradition was at its height. These communities were not independently inventing similar layouts. They were following a shared cultural template for how a settlement should be organized. And then they burned them down. Every Cucuteni Trypillia settlement that has been properly excavated shows the same thing. At the end of its period of use, the entire community was deliberately and systematically set on fire. Not one or two buildings, not a district or a quarter, but every house in the settlement, torched in what appears to have been a coordinated event. After the burning, the community moved to a new location, built a new settlement to the same plan, occupied it for roughly 60 to 80 years, and burned that one down too. This happened repeatedly across the full span of the culture's existence, at site after site, across a wide geographic area. The fires were not the result of attack or accident. Researchers can tell this from how the burning was carried out. The fires were started from inside the houses, not outside. In many cases, the contents of the houses appear to have been arranged before the burning, with objects placed in specific positions rather than left where they happened to be in daily use. This points to some kind of preparation before the fire was set, a deliberate process rather than a hurried departure. The communities did not flee and leave their homes to be destroyed. They arranged things, set the fires themselves, and moved on. What this means in practical terms is that the Cucuteni Trypillia people spent a significant portion of their cultural energy building large, carefully planned communities, and then destroying them on purpose, repeatedly, over the course of more than 1,000 years. The effort involved in constructing a settlement housing 10,000 people is enormous. The effort involved in then systematically burning every structure in that settlement to the ground is also considerable. Doing this cycle over and over, generation after generation, as a deliberate cultural practice, points to a belief system or social logic that was strong enough to override what most people would consider the obvious appeal of simply staying in the settlement you had already built. Why they did it is the question that has never been answered. The theories on offer cover a wide range. Religious practice is the most commonly proposed explanation, with the burning interpreted as a ritual act connected to beliefs about renewal, purification, or the relationship between communities and the land they occupied. Practical responses to soil exhaustion have been proposed, with the burning clearing the site and the community moving to allow the land to recover, though this does not explain the deliberate interior arrangement of objects before the fire. Disease control has been suggested, with the burning serving to eliminate whatever had built up in a densely occupied settlement over decades, a form of social reset, periodically destroying accumulated wealth and starting fresh, has also been put forward. None of these explanations has been confirmed, and none of them accounts for all the features of what the archaeology actually shows. The population question adds another layer. Feeding and supplying 10 to 15,000 people in a single settlement in Copper Age Europe was a significant logistical challenge. The agricultural land required to sustain a community of that size had to be organized and managed, and the Cucuteni Trypillia record does not fully document how this was achieved. There is evidence of crop cultivation and animal herding, but the full scale of the food production system that supported the Megasites has not been reconstructed. Around 3500 BC, the entire culture disappears from the record. The Megasites stop being built. The distinctive pottery, the figurines, the circular settlement layouts, all of it is gone, replaced by material culture associated with different populations moving into the region. Where the Cucuteni Trypillia people went, whether they were displaced, absorbed, or simply dispersed across a wider area and lost their cultural cohesion in the process, has not been established. One of the largest prehistoric cultures in European history, responsible for some of the biggest settlements in the ancient world, left the record without explanation, and the communities that came after them built nothing like what had been there before. Most people who have heard of Göbekli Tepe know the basic story. A site in southeastern Turkey, around 12,000 years old, containing monumental stone temples built by hunter-gatherers at a point in history when nobody was supposed to be capable of that kind of construction. It rewrote what researchers thought they knew about the origins of organized religion and large-scale architecture, and it has been one of the most talked about archaeological discoveries of the past 30 years. What most people do not know is that Göbekli Tepe is not alone. About 150 kilometers to the east, in the Mardin province of southeastern Turkey, near the town of Dargasit, in the upper Tigris Valley, there is a site called Boncuklu Tarla. Excavations there began in 2012 under the direction of Ergul Kodas of Artuklu University, and what has come out of the ground since then has been attracting serious international attention. A 2022 study in the journal Antiquity formally introduced the site to the broader archaeological community, describing it as one of the most significant early Neolithic sites yet found and calling for expanded excavation. The site dates to approximately 12,000 years ago, placing it at the same point in history as Göbekli Tepe, or possibly earlier. What researchers have found at Boncuklu Tarla is a combination of features that, taken together, paint a picture of a community doing things that the conventional timeline for early human development was not built to accommodate. There are monumental stone buildings with carved decorations. There are T-shaped pillars, the same architectural feature that defines Göbekli Tepe and gives it such a distinctive appearance. There is evidence of ritual feasting on a significant scale, and there are human skulls that appear to have been deliberately modified and put on display. Then there are the beads. Over 100,000 beads have been recovered from Boncuklu Tarla so far, made from stone, shell, and obsidian, with some of the raw materials traced to sources hundreds of miles from the site. That is the highest density of beads found at any site of this age anywhere in the world. What exactly they were used for has not been established. They could have been decorative, worn as personal ornament. They could have been ritual objects connected to the ceremonies taking place at the monumental buildings. They could have served an economic function, used in exchange or as markers of status. The sheer quantity of them and the variety of materials they were made from points to beads being a significant part of life at Boncuklu Tarla, but the specifics of what that looked like in practice are not yet clear. 12,000 years ago sits at the very beginning of what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, the period when human communities in the Fertile Crescent were starting to shift away from nomadic hunting and gathering towards settled life and agriculture. This transition is one of the most studied periods in human prehistory, and the conventional picture of it places the development of social complexity, organized religion, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade as consequences of that shift, things that became possible once people settled down and started producing food surpluses. The standard sequence runs roughly like this. Farming comes first, then surplus, then social hierarchy, then monuments, and religion. Boncuklu Tarla, like Göbekli Tepe, does not fit that sequence. The site is 12,000 years old, which places it at the very beginning of the Neolithic transition, before large-scale agriculture was established in the region. And yet, it already has monumental architecture, ritual spaces, evidence of organized feasting, and a long-distance trade network capable of sourcing materials from hundreds of miles away. If the sequence was supposed to run farming first and complexity second, someone at Boncuklu Tarla did not get the message. The T-shaped pillars connect the site clearly to Göbekli Tepe and to a broader network of early Neolithic sites across the region that share architectural and cultural features. Researchers working in southeastern Turkey and northern Syria have identified a growing number of sites from this period that appear to have been part of the same broad cultural world, communities that were connected to each other through shared beliefs, shared architectural traditions, and shared material culture. Boncuklu Tarla sits within that network, though it also shows features that are distinct from Göbekli Tepe, pointing to regional variation within what was clearly not a single uniform culture. The relationship between these sites and what exactly they tell us about how early Neolithic communities were organized is one of the most active areas of current archaeological research. The skull modification at Boncuklu Tarla is one of the more striking details to emerge from the excavations. Human skulls that show signs of deliberate modification and display have been found at several early Neolithic sites in the region, including Göbekli Tepe and sites in the Jordan Valley. The practice is often described as ancestor veneration, or a skull cult, though neither of those labels fully captures what was actually going on. The skulls appear to have been treated as significant objects after death, potentially displayed in ritual contexts or kept as part of ongoing ceremonial practice. How this connected to the monumental architecture at these sites, whether the buildings were the setting for skull-related rituals, or whether the two practices were simply part of the same broader religious tradition, is not fully understood. What makes Boncuklu Tarla particularly valuable is that it is still being excavated. The site is large, and what has been uncovered so far represents only a portion of what is there. Each season of fieldwork has added new material and new complexity to the picture, and the expectation among the researchers involved is that the site has considerably more to reveal. The 2022 Antiquity paper was in part a call to the wider archaeological community to pay attention to Boncuklu Tarla and to support the expansion of excavation work there, reflecting a sense among the researchers that the site has the potential to reshape understanding of this critical period in human prehistory, in the same way that Göbekli Tepe did when it first came to wide attention in the 1990s. The Upper Tigris Valley, where Boncuklu Tarla sits, was, 12,000 years ago, a landscape in transition. The climate was shifting at the end of the last ice age. Wild plant and animal species that people had been hunting and gathering for thousands of years were changing in their distribution, and communities across the Fertile Crescent were beginning to experiment with new ways of managing their food supply. Into that context, Boncuklu Tarla presents a community that was already building temples, already connected to distant trading partners, and already engaging in complex ritual practices involving the dead. Whatever was driving the development of social complexity in this part of the world, it was clearly well underway before farming took hold. From the temple sites of southeastern Turkey, we move to the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and to a culture that most people have heard of, but very few actually know much about. The Olmec are often described as the mother civilization of Mesoamerica, the culture that came before the Maya and the Aztec, and whose influence can be traced through both of them. They carved the colossal stone heads that remain one of the most recognizable images in pre-Columbian art. They built large ceremonial centers, developed a sophisticated religious and artistic tradition that spread across a wide region, and for a long time, they were thought to have left no writing. That changed in 2006. In the 1990s, road workers near the town of Cascajal in Veracruz, Mexico, turned up a flat serpentine stone tablet while clearing ground. It passed through several hands before reaching researchers, and when it did, it was recognized as something significant. A study published in the journal Science in 2006 formally presented the Cascajal block to the academic world. The conclusion was straightforward and striking. This was the oldest known example of writing anywhere in the Americas, dated to approximately 900 BC. The block is covered in 62 symbols arranged in horizontal rows. The symbols include geometric shapes, representations of natural objects, and more abstract signs. And crucially, some of the symbol groups repeat in ways that suggest a structured system rather than random marks or simple decoration. Repeated symbol groups are one of the key indicators of a genuine writing system because they point to the same words or concepts being recorded more than once. The Cascajal block has enough of this internal patterning to make a strong case for being a real script rather than decorative carving. The researchers who published the 2006 study were careful in their language, noting that the evidence was consistent with a writing system without making stronger claims than the evidence could support, but the broader conclusion that this was intentional, structured communication recorded in symbols has held up to scrutiny. Before this discovery, the oldest known writing in the Americas was attributed to later Mesoamerican cultures, with the earliest confirmed examples coming several centuries after the Olmec period. The Cascajal block pushed that timeline back significantly and handed the credit for inventing writing in the Americas to the Olmec, a culture whose relationship to the civilizations that came after them is already one of the most debated questions in the field. The Olmec flourished along the Gulf Coast of Mexico from roughly 1,500 to 400 BC. Their two major ceremonial centers were San Lorenzo and La Venta, both of which have been extensively excavated, and both of which continue to produce new findings. San Lorenzo is the older of the two, reaching its peak influence around 1000 BC, with La Venta rising to prominence after San Lorenzo's decline and remaining active until around 400 BC. At their height, the Olmec were the dominant cultural force in Mesoamerica, and their influence on later cultures is visible in artistic motifs, religious symbolism, and architectural traditions that appear across the Maya world and beyond. The famous colossal heads, portraits of specific rulers, carved from basalt boulders weighing up to 40 tons and transported from quarries dozens of miles away, are the most immediately striking evidence of their capabilities. 17 of these heads have been found across Olmec sites, each one distinct and believed to represent a specific individual ruler, making them one of the earliest known traditions of portrait sculpture anywhere in the Americas. Who the Olmec actually were is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered. Their ethnic identity, the language they spoke, the structure of their political organization, and the origins of their culture are all disputed. Several researchers over the years have proposed that the Olmec had connections to cultures from outside the Americas, pointing to features of the colossal heads that some have read as African in appearance, and to artistic elements that others have compared to styles from China or Southeast Asia. The mainstream archaeological view is that the Olmec were a fully indigenous Mesoamerican development with no meaningful outside influence, and the genetic and archaeological evidence supports that position. But the debate about Olmec origins has a long history and has not entirely gone away, resurfacing periodically in both academic and popular discussions of pre-Columbian history. The more immediate problem with the Cascajal block is that it cannot be read. The block is the only known example of Olmec writing. There is no second inscription, no parallel text, no bilingual document that might provide a way in. Deciphering an unknown script without any of these reference points is extraordinarily difficult. The methods that cracked Linear B, the ancient Greek script, and that eventually allowed researchers to read Egyptian hieroglyphs, all depended on having multiple examples to work with, or a bilingual text where the same content appears in a known language alongside the unknown one. The Rosetta Stone, which unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs, worked precisely because it carried the same royal decree in 3 scripts, one of which was already understood. With just a single block and 62 symbols, none of those approaches can be applied. The Cascajal script may remain unread until another example of Olmec writing turns up somewhere, and given that no other example has surfaced in the decades since the block was identified, there is no guarantee that one ever will. One detail about the block itself adds another layer to the mystery. The surface shows signs of having been deliberately marked or scored before it was deposited, in a way that some researchers interpret as intentional defacement. The suggestion is that the block may have been ritually decommissioned before being buried, effectively retired from use through a deliberate act, rather than simply discarded or lost. If that is correct, it implies that the object had a specific kind of significance, and that its deposition was a considered act, rather than an accident of preservation. It also raises the possibility that the defacement was meant to neutralize whatever power or meaning the inscription carried, which opens up questions about how the Olmec understood the written word and what they believed it was capable of. In several ancient cultures, writing was regarded as carrying an active force, something that could be dangerous or powerful in its own right. Deliberately damaging a text before burying it fits that kind of belief system, though applying that framework to the Olmec without more evidence is speculative. The relationship between the Olmec script and the writing systems that developed later in Mesoamerica is another open question. The Maya developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient world, capable of recording history, mythology, astronomy, and administrative information in considerable detail. Researchers have long debated whether Maya writing developed independently or whether it drew on an earlier tradition, possibly Olmec. The Cascajal block does not provide a clear answer either way. The symbols on the block do not have obvious direct counterparts in Maya glyphs, which suggests the two systems were not simply related versions of the same script. But the Olmec cultural influence on the Maya was broad and deep in other respects, and it would not be surprising if the tradition of writing itself, even if not the specific symbols, passed from one culture to the other in some form. Ongoing excavation at San Lorenzo and La Venta has continued to refine the chronology of Olmec civilization and add detail to the picture of how these centers functioned. New finds regularly emerge from both sites, including evidence of large-scale construction, elaborate burial practices, and long-distance trade in materials like jade and obsidian sourced from hundreds of miles away. None of this work has produced another example of the Cascajal script, and the core questions about Olmec origins and the meaning of the block remain as open as they were when the 2006 study was published. What the Cascajal block represents is a writing system invented by a culture whose own origins are unclear, recorded on a single surviving object that has been deliberately damaged and cannot be deciphered, belonging to a civilization that influenced every major culture that followed it in Mesoamerica, while leaving almost no readable record of its own beliefs, history, or internal life. The culture that produced it went on to shape the Maya, the Aztec, and others, and yet the script they invented left no clear descendants in any of the writing systems that came after. Of all the missing tombs in Egyptian history, one stands above the rest, not because of the gold it might contain, or the treasures that might be waiting inside, but because of the woman it belonged to, and the questions her burial might finally answer. Nefertiti has been one of the most famous faces of the ancient world since her painted limestone bust was unveiled in Berlin in 1924. She was the great royal wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history, and possibly one of its most powerful rulers, and nobody knows where she is buried. Nefertiti lived and ruled during what historians call the Amarna period, roughly 1350 to 1330 BC, one of the most unusual and contested chapters in all of Egyptian history. Her husband Akhenaten did something no Egyptian pharaoh had done before or would do again. He dismantled the existing religious order, closed the temples of the traditional gods, stripped the priests of their power, and declared that Egypt would worship a single deity, the Aten, represented as the disk of the sun. He built an entirely new capital city for this new religion, a place called Akhetaten, on a stretch of desert that is now known as Amarna, and moved the entire apparatus of Egyptian state there. It was one of the most radical transformations in the history of any ancient civilization, carried out within a single reign. Nefertiti appears prominently throughout Akhenaten's rule, depicted in temple reliefs in roles that are unusually active and authoritative even by the standards of Egyptian royal women. In some images, she is shown smiting enemies, a pose traditionally reserved for pharaohs. In others, she presides over religious ceremonies in ways that suggest real religious authority rather than ceremonial presence. Toward the end of Akhenaten's reign, she disappears from the official record, and what happened to her after that is one of the most debated questions in Egyptology. Some researchers believe she died before Akhenaten. Others argue that she outlived him and ruled Egypt herself under the name Neferuaten, a pharaoh who appears in the record between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, and whose identity has never been definitively established. If Nefertiti and Neferuaten are the same person, she was not just a royal wife. She was a pharaoh in her own right. After Akhenaten's death, the religious revolution he had imposed was reversed quickly and thoroughly. The temples of the traditional gods were reopened, the Aten cult was dismantled, and Amarna was abandoned. Within a generation, the pharaohs who followed, including Tutankhamun and his successor Horemheb, were actively working to erase the Amarna period from the official record, chiseling out Akhenaten's name from monuments and removing references to his reign from the king lists. The erasure was systematic enough that for a long time in the modern era, Akhenaten was not even known to historians. His existence was only fully reconstructed in the 19th and 20th centuries from the very monuments that had been meant to erase him. In that context, the absence of Nefertiti's tomb makes a certain kind of sense. The people who came after her had strong reasons to make her disappear from the record, and they were effective at it. But a tomb, if it exists and if it was sealed in time, would be much harder to erase than an inscription. It would potentially contain objects bearing her name, texts recording her titles and her history, and possibly inscriptions that settle the question of whether she ruled as pharaoh. Finding it intact would be, by any measure, one of the great Egyptological discoveries of the modern era. In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves published a paper that sent a wave of excitement through the field. Working from high-resolution scans of the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, Reeves argued that he could see the outlines of two blocked doorways hidden behind the painted plaster of the burial chamber walls. One of these, he proposed, led to a storage room. The other, he suggested, led to a second burial chamber. And that chamber, he argued, was the original tomb of Nefertiti, into which Tutankhamun had been placed as a secondary occupant when he died unexpectedly young, with his own tomb unfinished. The theory was based on careful analysis of the tomb's layout, the direction of the painted decoration near the walls in question, and what Reeves identified as inconsistencies in the plasterwork that he believed indicated doorways filled in and painted over. It was not a fringe proposal. Reeves is a respected Egyptologist with deep knowledge of the Valley of the Kings, and the paper was taken seriously enough that the Egyptian authorities commissioned ground-penetrating radar surveys of the tomb walls in 2015 and 2016 to test whether anything was there. The initial results appeared promising. The first radar survey, carried out by a Japanese team, reported anomalies behind the north wall of the burial chamber that were described as consistent with a void or open space. A second team reported similar findings. The announcement made international headlines, and there was a period of real anticipation that Nefertiti's tomb might be about to be found inside the most famous tomb in Egypt. Then the results got complicated. A third radar survey, carried out by a different team using different equipment, found no evidence of hidden spaces behind the walls. The conflicting results produced a dispute between the teams involved that became quite public, with each side questioning the methodology of the other. The Egyptian authorities brought in additional teams, and the results continued to disagree. Some saw anomalies, others saw nothing. The disagreement has never been fully resolved, and access to conduct further testing inside Tutankhamun's tomb has been managed carefully given how significant and fragile the site is. Where things stand now is that the Reeves theory is neither confirmed nor ruled out. The radar evidence is genuinely contested, and without a physical investigation of the walls themselves, which would involve opening sections of painted plaster that have survived for 3,000 years, the question cannot be settled by remote sensing alone. More recent scanning work using updated technology has been conducted at the site, but the results have not been publicly released in full. Not everyone agrees that the Valley of the Kings is where Nefertiti's tomb should be sought. A significant number of researchers argue that if Nefertiti died during or shortly after Akhenaten's reign, she would most likely have been buried at Amarna, the city that was built for the religious revolution she was part of. Several royal tombs have been found at Amarna, including one that appears to have been used by Akhenaten himself. The royal tomb at Amarna was robbed in antiquity and its contents largely destroyed, and it is possible that Nefertiti's burial, if it was in the same necropolis, suffered the same fate long before modern archaeologists arrived. If the tomb is ever found, and found intact, what it might contain is worth considering. Any burial of Nefertiti with clear identifying inscriptions would immediately become one of the most studied objects in Egyptology. The texts, the objects, and the physical remains could shed light on who she was, what role she played in the final years of the Amarna period, whether she ruled as pharaoh, and what her relationship to Tutankhamun actually was. The Amarna period remains one of the most debated and least understood chapters in Egyptian history, and Nefertiti sits at its center. Her tomb, wherever it is, has the potential to change a significant part of what we think we know about it. In 1922, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley arrived at the ancient city of Ur in what is now southern Iraq and began one of the most significant excavations in the history of the ancient world. Woolley would work at the site for 12 years, and what he found there would shock the archaeological community in ways that the passage of a century has done nothing to diminish. Ur was one of the great cities of ancient Sumer, a civilization that flourished in Mesopotamia from roughly 3,500 BC onward, and that is credited with some of the foundational developments of human history, among them the invention of writing, the wheel, and some of the earliest legal codes. At its peak, Ur was a major urban and religious center, home to a large population and dominated by a towering step temple called a ziggurat, dedicated to the moon god, Nana. By the time Woolley arrived, the city had been abandoned for centuries, buried under the desert of southern Iraq. What Woolley uncovered in the cemetery area of the site was a collection of 16 royal tombs dating to approximately 2600 BC, belonging to the early Sumerian ruling class. The tombs were richly furnished, containing gold, silver, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and objects of extraordinary craftsmanship that immediately marked them as among the most elaborate burials found anywhere in the ancient Near East. But the objects were not what made the discovery so unsettling. Several of the tombs contained additional human remains, not one or two attendants buried alongside a ruler, but dozens of people, arranged in large pits adjacent to the main burial chamber. In the tomb of Queen Puabi and several others, these pits held the remains of up to 74 individuals in a single deposit. The people in the pits were wearing their court dress. They were accompanied by musical instruments, gaming boards, gold drinking vessels, and other luxury objects. They were arranged in orderly rows, and they showed no signs of having been killed by force. Woolley called them death pits. The question he could not answer, and that researchers have been working on ever since, is what exactly happened in them. Queen Puabi's tomb is the best preserved and most studied of the royal burials at Ur. Puabi herself was found in a wooden chamber within the tomb, wearing one of the most spectacular headdresses ever recovered from the ancient world, a towering construction of gold leaves, gold ribbons, lapis lazuli, and carnelian that would have required considerable skill to produce and considerable effort to wear. A lapis lazuli cylinder seal found with her bore her name and the title Nin, meaning lady or queen, confirming her identity. 2 attendants were buried within the chamber itself, positioned near the queen. Outside the chamber, in the death pit, were the remains of 23 additional people, including what appear to have been musicians, with instruments still positioned beside them. The musical instruments found across the royal tombs at Ur are some of the most remarkable objects to survive from the ancient world. Lyres and harps decorated with gold bulls' heads and inlaid panels were recovered from multiple pits, and in some cases, the skeletal remains of the musicians were found still positioned as if they had been playing when they died. Whether that positioning reflects how they actually died, or whether the bodies were arranged after death by others, is not something that can be determined from the skeletal evidence alone. The absence of trauma marks on the bones of the death pit individuals is the detail that drives the most debate. People who are killed by force, whether by stabbing, blunt force, strangulation, or other means, typically show physical evidence of that violence in their bones or skulls. The individuals in the Ur death pits do not show this evidence, at least not in the examinations carried out so far. They appear to have died in place, in their arranged positions, without struggle or injury. The most widely discussed explanation is poison, consumed voluntarily as part of the burial ritual. Sumerian religious texts describe the afterlife as a gray and joyless underworld for most people, a shadowy place where the dead existed in a diminished form. But the very elite, particularly rulers, and those connected to them, were believed to occupy a more elevated existence in death. If the attendants in the death pits believed they were going to continue serving their queen in a realm where that service would be meaningful, and where their own existence would be better than the standard Sumerian afterlife, the voluntary consumption of a lethal substance before the tomb was sealed becomes at least comprehensible as a cultural logic, even if it remains deeply disturbing by any modern measure. In 2019, a study published in PLOS One added a significant new piece of evidence to this picture. Bioarchaeological analysis of skulls from the death pits found traces of a mercury-based compound in multiple individuals. Mercury compounds were used in the ancient world for various purposes, and their presence in the skulls is consistent with a poison having been administered or consumed before death. The study confirmed the presence of these compounds in several individuals across different pits, making it one of the more concrete pieces of physical evidence yet recovered about how the people in the death pits actually died. What the mercury compound was, whether it was a specific preparation, how it was administered, and whether all of the individuals in the pits consumed it or only some, are questions the study raised without fully answering. The analysis also cannot determine whether the consumption was voluntary. A substance that causes death can be taken willingly or administered without consent, and the physical evidence does not distinguish between the two. The practice of accompanying burials appears only in a specific and narrow window of Sumerian history. The royal cemetery at Ur dates to the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2300 BC, and the death pits are concentrated within an even shorter span within that period. Later Sumerian and Babylonian royal burials do not show the same practice, and there is no clear evidence of accompanying burials on this scale at other Sumerian cities from the same period. Why this practice existed at Ur, why it happened in this specific window of time and then stopped, and whether it was unique to Ur or whether similar burials at other sites simply have not yet been found, are all open questions. The religious framework that produced the death pits at Ur has never been fully reconstructed. The Sumerian texts that survive from this period do not contain a direct account of the burial ritual or the beliefs that underpinned it. Later Sumerian literature, including the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, gives some sense of how the Sumerians thought about death and the afterlife, but applying those later texts to a ritual practice from several centuries earlier is not straightforward. The gap between what the death pits physically show and what researchers can say with confidence about why they happened remains wide, and it may stay that way given the limits of the available evidence. Leonard Woolley's excavations at ran from 1922 to 1934, and the objects he recovered are now split between the British Museum in London, the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. The site itself has been the subject of ongoing study and some additional excavation since Woolley's time, though nothing has yet emerged to dramatically change the picture he established. The royal tombs at remain one of the most studied and most debated sets of burials in the ancient world, and the central question of what it meant to die in one of those pits, and whether the people who did so had any real say in the matter, has never been answered. From the death pits of ancient Sumer, we travel east, a long way east, to a peninsula in northeastern Asia, where something happened during the Bronze Age that has never been fully accounted for, and that most people outside Korea have never heard of. Korea has more megalithic dolmens than any other country on Earth. More than 30,000 of them, spread across the entire peninsula from the northern mountains down to the southern coast. To put that number in perspective, all of Europe combined has fewer. The whole of the rest of East Asia has almost none. And yet on the Korean peninsula, during the Bronze Age, communities were raising these structures by the thousand for centuries, in a tradition so large and so sustained that it still has not been fully mapped or explained. A dolmen is a straightforward type of megalithic structure. Two or more upright stones are placed in the ground to form the walls of a chamber, and a large flat capstone is laid across the top. The result is a table-like form that looks simple enough in design, but becomes considerably more complex when you start considering the scale of the stones involved. The capstones on the largest Korean dolmens weigh over 250 tons. To carry that number for a moment, that is heavier than the largest stones used at Stonehenge, and the people moving them were doing so without wheeled vehicles, without metal tools, and without draft animals capable of handling loads of that size. How they did it has never been definitively established. Korean dolmens fall broadly into two regional styles. In the northern part of the peninsula, the table type is most common, with large upright stones forming a visible above-ground chamber topped by the capstone. In the south, the capstone type dominates, where the burial chamber is dug below ground, and only the capstone sits visibly at the surface, sometimes resting directly on the ground or on smaller support stones. The southern capstone type tends to involve the largest stones, which makes the engineering challenge more significant in the very regions where the tradition was most widely practiced. In 2003 dolmen sites, Gocheong, Hwasun, and Ganghwa, were designated UNESCO World Heritage Sites, formally recognizing the Korean dolmen tradition as one of the most significant megalithic cultures in the world. The UNESCO designation brought increased attention to the sites, but the broader international awareness of what Korea contains in terms of prehistoric monuments has remained relatively low compared to the scale of what is actually there. The dolmens date to the Korean Bronze Age, running from roughly 1,500 to 300 BC. This was a period of significant change on the peninsula. The relatively egalitarian communities of the preceding Neolithic were giving way to more stratified societies, with emerging differences in wealth, status, and power that would eventually produce the early Korean kingdoms. The dolmens are one of the clearest pieces of evidence for this transition. The largest and most elaborate examples are associated with high-status burials, suggesting they marked the graves of individuals who held significant social position within their communities. Building a dolmen with a 250-ton capstone required organizing and directing a substantial labor force, which in turn implies the existence of authority structures capable of mobilizing that kind of effort. The burial goods found within Korean dolmens include bronze daggers, polished stone daggers, jade ornaments, and pottery, reflecting the material culture of the Bronze Age peninsula and confirming the burial function of the structures. The bronze daggers, in particular, are associated with elite status across Bronze Age Korean sites, and their presence in dolmen burials reinforces the picture of these monuments as markers of social distinction rather than communal burial grounds. What has never been explained is why this tradition developed to such an extraordinary scale on the Korean peninsula specifically. Megalithic traditions exist in other parts of the world, in Europe, in South Asia, in parts of Southeast Asia, and researchers have generally concluded that these traditions developed independently rather than spreading from a single source. The Korean dolmen tradition fits that pattern of independent development, but the sheer concentration of structures on the peninsula, 30,000 in an area roughly the size of the United Kingdom, goes far beyond anything seen elsewhere. Something about the social, cultural, or environmental conditions of Bronze Age Korea produced a megalithic building tradition on a scale that no other region matched. GIS mapping surveys carried out in recent years have produced more accurate counts of the surviving dolmens and revealed patterns in how they are distributed across the landscape. The results show clear regional clustering, with dolmens concentrated in specific areas in ways that suggest the tradition was more coordinated across communities than previously understood. Rather than each community independently deciding to build dolmens, the clustering patterns point to shared cultural practices spreading across wider networks, with groups in the same geographic areas following consistent traditions in terms of size, style, and placement. This coordination across communities adds another layer to the organizational picture, suggesting that the dolmen building tradition involved communication and shared practice between groups, separated by significant distances. The transport question is one that researchers keep returning to. Experimental archaeology projects in Korea and elsewhere have tested various methods for moving large stones without modern equipment, using wooden sledges, rollers, ropes, and large numbers of people working together. These experiments have demonstrated that moving stones of considerable size is achievable with enough labor and the right technique, but they have not definitively established how stones in the 200-ton range were actually handled. The largest capstones in Korea are at the upper end of what experimental archaeology has convincingly demonstrated, and the specific methods used by Bronze Age Korean communities to source, transport, and position these stones remain a matter of ongoing investigation rather than settled fact. The religious and cosmological beliefs that drove the dolmen tradition are poorly understood. The Korean peninsula in the Bronze Age left no written records, and the oral traditions that might have preserved knowledge of what the dolmens meant have not survived in a form that can be directly connected to the monuments. Researchers infer religious significance from the care taken in construction and the quality of the burial goods, but the specific beliefs about death, the afterlife, and the relationship between the living and the dead that shape the tradition are not recoverable from the physical evidence alone. What happened to the dolmen building culture as Korea moved into its early historic period is also not entirely clear. The tradition fades from the record as the first Korean kingdoms begin to emerge, replaced by different burial practices connected to the new social and political structures of the early states. Whether the communities that built the dolmens were absorbed into the emerging kingdoms, displaced, or simply adapted their practices as their world changed, is a question the archaeological record does not fully answer. 30,000 monuments across an entire peninsula, and the people who built them left no account of themselves beyond the stones. In the middle of the Mediterranean, on a small island that most people could not place on a map without help, there are two temples that predate Stonehenge by over 1,000 years, and the pyramids of Egypt by around 900. They are the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world, and the people who built them disappeared so completely that when the next wave of inhabitants arrived on the island, they had no idea what they were looking at. The island is Gozo, part of the Maltese archipelago, and the temples are called Ggantija, which in Maltese means Tower of the Giants. That name was not given by the people who built them. It was given by the communities who arrived later and found these enormous stone structures standing on the hillside without any explanation for how they had been raised. The scale of the construction seemed to them to require a race of giants, and the name stuck. Ggantija dates to approximately 3,600 BC, placing its construction deep in the Neolithic period. Two temples sit side by side within a shared outer wall, built from blocks of coralline limestone, some of which weigh over 50 tons. The walls still stand up to 6 meters high in places, which is remarkable for a structure over 5,000 years old that has been exposed to the elements without significant maintenance for most of that time. The internal layout of both temples follows a trefoil plan, a series of curved apses arranged around a central corridor, a design that appears across the Maltese temple tradition, and that was clearly the product of a specific and developed architectural tradition rather than improvised construction. The people who built Ggantija are known to researchers as the Temple Period culture, a population that inhabited the Maltese islands from roughly 5,000 to 2,500 BC. Over that 1,500-year period, they built an extraordinary number of temples across the small island group, many of which survive in varying states of preservation. Alongside the physical structures, they produced some of the most striking prehistoric sculpture in the Mediterranean world, including large figurines of rounded human forms that are often described as fertility figures, and smaller objects of considerable skill and refinement. They painted their temples with red ochre. They conducted elaborate rituals involving animal sacrifice. They developed a mortuary tradition that involved gathering the bones of the dead in underground spaces and treating them as part of ongoing ritual practice. How the Temple Period people moved and positioned limestone blocks weighing 50 tons without metal tools, wheeled vehicles, or large draft animals is a question that has never been answered to everyone's satisfaction. The coralline limestone used for the outer walls of Ggantija is harder and more durable than the softer Globigerina limestone used for interior elements, and quarrying it without metal tools was itself a significant undertaking. Experimental archaeology projects have shown that moving large stones using wooden rollers, sledges, and organized teams of people is achievable in principle. But the practicalities of doing this repeatedly, at scale, on a small island with limited resources, point to a level of social organization and logistical capability that the conventional picture of Neolithic island communities does not always capture. Inside the temples, the evidence of ritual practice is considerable. Animal bones, primarily from cattle, sheep, and pigs, point to repeated sacrificial activity. Figurines depicting human and animal forms were placed within the temple spaces. Human bones have been found in and around the structures, suggesting the temples were connected to the treatment and commemoration of the dead, as well as to the worship of whatever deities the Temple Period people recognized. The dominant religious figure across the Maltese temple tradition appears to have been a large, rounded deity form, represented in multiple figurines found across different sites, though whether this represents a single deity or a broader symbolic tradition is debated. The connection to the underground Hal Saflieni hypogam on the main island of Malta fills out the picture considerably. The hypogam, which was carved from solid rock over several centuries during the same period as Ggantija, contains the remains of over 7,000 individuals. It is the only known prehistoric underground temple in the world, and its scale and the number of people deposited within it suggest that the mortuary practices of the Temple Period culture operated on a level far beyond what the above-ground temples alone would indicate. The same culture that raised the oldest freestanding stone structures in the world was also carving an elaborate underground burial complex capable of holding thousands of the dead. The two traditions appear to have been part of a single integrated religious and ceremonial system, though how exactly they related to each other is not fully understood. Around 2500 BC, the Temple Period culture ended. The temples were abandoned. The artistic tradition stopped. The population that had sustained this culture across 1,500 years of island life was gone. When new groups arrived on the Maltese islands in the subsequent centuries, they brought different material culture, different burial practices, and no apparent memory of or connection to what had come before. What happened to the Temple Period people is one of the most open questions in Mediterranean prehistory. Disease has been proposed, with the isolation of island populations making them potentially vulnerable to new pathogens introduced by outside contact. Environmental collapse is another possibility, with soil exhaustion or deforestation after centuries of intensive occupation making the islands unable to support the existing population. Climate shifts during this period have also been suggested. Conflict with incoming groups is a further option, though there is limited physical evidence for large-scale violence at this point in the Maltese sequence. None of these explanations has been confirmed, and the abruptness of the disappearance is striking regardless of cause. A culture with 1,500 years of continuous development on these islands, responsible for the oldest stone temples in the world and an underground burial complex holding thousands of the dead, left the Maltese archipelago without any identifiable successor tradition. The temples they built were substantial enough to survive the following 3,000 years largely intact. The people were not. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Ggantija site carried out in recent years have added a further complication to the picture. The surveys revealed subsurface features in the area around the visible temples that have not yet been excavated, pointing to the possibility that the visible complex represents only part of a larger site. What lies beneath the surface at Ggantija, whether additional structures, deposits, or features connected to the main temples, is not currently known. The visible temples have been studied for over 200 years, since the site was first excavated in 1827, and they are still giving up new information. About 30 kilometers east of Nanjing in Jiangsu Province, China, there is a quarry on a hillside that has been sitting untouched for over 600 years. Inside it are 3 enormous stone blocks, partially separated from the bedrock, fully carved, and going nowhere. They have been there since the early 1500s, when the workers who were cutting them out of the mountain walked away and never came back. What they were trying to build is one of the more staggering construction ambitions in human history. The blocks at Yangshan Quarry were commissioned for the tomb complex of Zhu Yuanzhang, the founder of the Ming dynasty, who died in 1398. Zhu Yuanzhang had risen from extreme poverty to overthrow the Mongol Yuan dynasty and establish one of the most powerful imperial houses China would ever see. His tomb, the Xiaoling Mausoleum outside Nanjing, is an enormous and elaborate complex that took decades to build and remains one of the most significant imperial burial sites in the country. The stele planned for it was intended to be a commemoration on a scale that matched the ambition of the man it honored. The 3 blocks at Yangshan were designed to fit together into a single monument. The base measures approximately 31 meters long and 16 meters wide. The tablet, the central section bearing the inscription, measures approximately 49 meters long and 14 meters wide. The cap, which would have sat at the top, is approximately 30 meters long. Assembled, the completed stele would have stood roughly 73 meters tall and weighed an estimated 31,000 tons. To give that weight some context, the largest stone ever successfully moved and placed in the ancient world is generally considered to be the Thunderstone in St. Petersburg, a granite boulder used as the base of the famous bronze horseman statue. It weighs approximately 1,500 tons and was moved over several kilometers in the 18th century, using a combination of sledges, rails, and considerable ingenuity in what was regarded at the time as an extraordinary engineering achievement. The Yangshan stele would have been more than 20 times heavier than that. The early Ming dynasty was a period of ambitious imperial construction on a scale that few civilizations have matched. The same era saw the rebuilding of significant stretches of the Great Wall, the construction of the Forbidden City in Beijing, and the launch of Zheng He's famous naval expeditions, which sent fleets of enormous ships across the Indian Ocean as far as East Africa. The imperial court had access to vast resources, enormous pools of organized labor, and considerable engineering expertise. If any historical government had the means to attempt a project like the Yangshan stele, it was the early Ming, and they still could not finish it. The quarrying work that was completed is impressive in itself. Looking at the blocks today, the channels cut around them to separate them from the surrounding bedrock are precise and clearly the product of skilled and experienced stoneworkers. The surfaces of the blocks that were intended to be visible are smoothed and finished. Structural analysis has confirmed that the stones are in good condition despite being partially embedded in the hillside for 6 centuries, and that the carving and finishing work was well advanced before the project stopped. This was not a scheme that collapsed in its early stages. Significant work had been before the decision was made to abandon it. The most likely reason the project stopped is that the engineers eventually confronted what the numbers had perhaps always suggested, that there was no practical way to move stones of this size from the quarry to the tomb site. The quarry sits on a hillside, and the Xiaoling Mausoleum is some distance away across terrain that would have required the blocks to be lowered down the slope and then transported over ground, moving a 31,000-ton structure over any distance, without modern lifting equipment or motorized transport, is not a challenge that can be solved by adding more workers or more ropes. At a certain scale, the methods available simply stop working. What makes Yangshan worth thinking about is the question of how the project got this far in the first place. The people who planned and commissioned the stele were not ignorant of construction. The early Ming court was full of experienced engineers and builders who had overseen major projects across the country. They understood stone, they understood transport, and they had presumably made some kind of assessment of what the Yangshan stele would involve before the first cut was made. How they concluded that the project was worth attempting, whether they had a transport solution in mind that was never implemented, whether the commission was made by someone with imperial authority who nobody felt able to question, or whether the full scale of the challenge only became apparent once the cutting was underway, is not recorded in any document that has been found. The Ming imperial records of the period are extensive and cover the Xiaoling Mausoleum project in some detail, but the Yangshan blocks do not appear in them in a way that explains the decision to abandon the work. The stones simply stopped being worked on at some point in the early 15th century, and the quarry was left as it was. Over time, the site became known locally, but received little formal archaeological attention until relatively recently, when it began attracting visitors and researchers interested in what it reveals about the limits of imperial ambition. The Yangshan Quarry is unusual as an archaeological site, precisely because of what it shows about failure. Most ancient construction sites that survive into the modern era are the ones where the project succeeded: the pyramids, the cathedrals, the city walls. The abandoned and unfinished projects, the ones that reveal where ancient engineering hit its limits, are rarer and in some ways more informative. Yangshan shows the full sequence of a major ancient construction effort: the planning, the quarrying, the finishing work, and then the moment where it became clear that the next step could not be taken. The blocks are still there, fully carved and going nowhere, exactly where the Ming workers left them more than 600 years ago. In 1963, a man in central Turkey was renovating his house in the Cappadocia region when he knocked through a wall in his basement and found something he was not expecting. Behind the wall was a tunnel. He did not know it yet, but he had just opened the door to one of the largest underground cities ever discovered. The city is called Derinkuyu, a name that simply means deep well in Turkish, an oddly modest label for what turned out to be there. What lies beneath that ordinary house extends roughly 60 meters below the surface, spread across at least 18 distinct levels. Researchers estimate the complete city could have housed up to 20,000 people, along with their livestock, their food stores, and enough water to sustain them for extended periods underground. To put that number in perspective, that estimate would have made Derinkuyu comparable in size to a significant town of its era, except the entire town existed below the surface instead of on top of it. Cappadocia is a region of soft, volcanic rock, formed from ash deposited by eruptions millions of years ago that compacted into a stone called tuff. Tuff is soft enough to carve with simple tools, but hardens once exposed to the air. The people who lived there over thousands of years took advantage of that softness, carving extensively into the landscape both above ground, in the famous fairy chimney rock formations the region is known for today, and below ground in tunnel and chamber networks. Derinkuyu is the most developed example of that underground tradition found anywhere in the region. Inside the city are stables for animals, storage cellars for grain and other supplies, communal kitchens and dining areas, religious spaces including a large cruciform church carved into the 7th level, and a network of more than 50 ventilation shafts running from the deepest sections all the way up to the surface. Those shafts mattered more than they might sound. They were what allowed people to live at depth for extended periods without running out of breathable air, a genuinely sophisticated piece of engineering carved entirely by hand with no modern tools. The city also has large circular stone doors, some weighing several hundred kilograms, that could be rolled across tunnels to seal off sections from the inside. These doors could only be moved from within, so anyone sealed behind them controlled access completely, and anyone trying to get in from outside would be dealing with what was effectively a vault door carved from solid stone. The doors were placed at strategic points throughout the city, allowing different sections to be cut off from each other, which would have limited the damage if attackers somehow got into one part of the complex. The earliest sections of Derinkuyu are thought to date back to the Phrygian period, roughly 800 to 300 BC. The Phrygians were an Anatolian people known for their distinctive culture and their legendary King Midas, and the evidence suggests they carried out the earliest excavation work at the site, though some researchers think the origins could be even older, possibly connected to Hittite activity in the region centuries before the Phrygians arrived. Over the following centuries, the city was expanded considerably, with different cultures adding new levels and sections according to their own needs. The Byzantines made particularly heavy use of the site, expanding it further during a period when Cappadocia sat on the frontier between the Byzantine Empire and Arab forces pushing into Anatolia from the 7th century onward. By the time it reached the form discovered in 1963, Derinkuyu represented well over 1,000 years of building and expansion by different communities across different eras. The standard explanation for why Derinkuyu was built is simple enough on the surface. Cappadocia sat along contested routes through Anatolia and was repeatedly exposed to invasion and conflict over the centuries, from regional powers in the ancient period through to the long-running Arab-Byzantine wars and later threats during the medieval period. An underground refuge where the local population could disappear during periods of danger, sealed behind stone doors attackers could not move, makes practical sense as a defensive strategy, and there is precedent for this kind of underground refuge elsewhere in the ancient and medieval world. What this explanation does not fully cover is the sheer scale and permanence of what was actually built. A refuge meant for short-term use during an immediate threat does not normally need 18 levels, stables for livestock, long-term food storage, and a church big enough to hold a congregation. The facilities at Derinkuyu point to a place built for extended occupation, potentially weeks or months at a time, not a quick hiding spot for a few days until danger passed. Building and maintaining something this complex represents an enormous investment of labor sustained across generations, which suggests the threat the local population was responding to was not a single event, but an ongoing and serious concern that justified that level of commitment over a very long period. Derinkuyu is also not unique. It is one of more than 200 underground settlements identified across the Cappadocia region, varying considerably in size and complexity. Derinkuyu connects to another major underground city, Kaimakli, through a tunnel running several kilometers between the two sites. A connecting tunnel of that length raises its own questions about coordination between communities and the scale of underground construction across the wider region. If two major cities were linked by a tunnel that long, it raises the possibility that other underground settlements nearby were similarly connected, forming a network whose full extent has never been properly mapped. How many of these 200-plus sites actually connect to each other, and how far the tunnels really run, is still not fully known. Ongoing excavation work at Derinkuyu in recent years keeps revealing new sections of the city. Levels below what was previously thought to be the lowest floor have been found, suggesting the city goes even deeper underground than earlier documentation showed. Each new excavation season adds detail to the layout without producing a final, complete picture of how far the site actually extends, and researchers working there have noted that the pace of new discoveries has not slowed much, even decades after the initial find. What remains genuinely unresolved is the question of scale compared to threat. Building something on the level of Derinkuyu meant organizing labor across what was likely several generations, carving through solid rock with hand tools, designing a ventilation system capable of supporting thousands of people at depth, and coordinating defensive features like the rolling stone doors across multiple levels. That is an extraordinary commitment of resources for any ancient community to make. The historical record for the region during the periods of heaviest construction does document conflict and instability, but it does not clearly point to a single threat severe and sustained enough to obviously justify a response on this scale. Whether the people of Cappadocia were responding to threats that simply went undocumented in surviving records, or whether the underground cities served other purposes beyond pure defense that have not survived in the historical record, is something researchers are still working through. The site at Derinkuyu opened to the public in 1969, and a portion of the city, roughly the upper levels, is accessible to visitors today. The deeper sections remain closed, either for safety reasons or because excavation work is still ongoing in parts of the complex. What tourists see when they walk through Derinkuyu is only a fraction of what actually exists below the Cappadocian countryside, and the full story of why an entire civilization chose to build their lives underground, layer after layer, for well over 1,000 years, has not yet been fully told. Some of the mysteries on this list exist because nobody has found the answer yet. This next one is different. For a long time, the answer was known, and people in positions of power simply refused to accept it. In the hills of Masvingo province, in modern Zimbabwe, there is a ruined city covering roughly 722 hectares, the largest ancient stone structure anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. At its center stands the Great Enclosure, a massive curved wall up to 11 meters high and 5 meters thick, wrapping around an area of about 820 square meters. The wall is built entirely from granite blocks, carefully shaped and fitted together without any mortar holding them in place. This technique, known as dry stone walling, depends on getting the weight and shape of each stone exactly right, because there is nothing else keeping the structure standing, and it has been standing for over 600 years. The city is called Great Zimbabwe, and it gave the modern country its name when Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, a deliberate choice to honor the most significant pre-colonial achievement in the nation's history. The city was the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, a Shona state that reached the height of its power between the 11th and 15th centuries AD. At its peak, the kingdom controlled a significant stretch of southern Africa and maintained trading relationships that stretched across the Indian Ocean, first with Arab merchants and later with the Portuguese as European traders began reaching the region in the 16th century. The site itself is divided into several distinct areas, including the hill complex, believed to have served religious functions and possibly housed early rulers, the valley complex, where much of the general population lived, and the Great Enclosure, which sits apart from both and remains the most visually striking structure on the site. Estimates suggest the city may have housed somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people at its peak, making it one of the largest urban centers in the region during this period of African history. When European settlers and researchers first encountered Great Zimbabwe in any detail during the 19th century, the scale and sophistication of what they found created a problem for the prevailing attitudes of the time. Many of these early observers simply could not accept that indigenous African people had built something on this scale. Rather than reconsider their assumptions, a number of them invented alternative explanations. Theories circulated attributing the construction to Phoenicians, to ancient Egyptians, to Arab traders, and in one particularly persistent version, to the biblical Queen of Sheba. Karl Mauck, a German explorer who visited the site in 1871, was among those who promoted these outside builder theories, suggesting the ruins might be connected to the biblical land of Ophir. None of these theories had any solid evidence behind them. All of them shared the same underlying assumption that the people who actually lived in the region could not have been responsible for building it themselves. This was not simply a case of honest scientific uncertainty that later got corrected as more evidence came in. The colonial government of Rhodesia, which controlled the territory for much of the 20th century, actively worked to suppress archaeological findings that correctly identified the Shona people as the builders of Great Zimbabwe. Researchers who published accurate conclusions based on solid evidence were dismissed, discredited, or had their work blocked from wider circulation. David Randall McIver, a British archaeologist who excavated the site in 1905 and concluded the ruins were of African origin and relatively recent construction, faced significant pushback for his findings. Gertrude Caton Thompson conducted further excavations in the 1920s and reached the same conclusion with even stronger evidence, and she too encountered resistance from a colonial establishment unwilling to accept what the archaeology clearly showed. The political reality of a colonial government built on the idea of European superiority did not leave room for evidence that indigenous Africans had built one of the most impressive stone structures on the continent centuries before any European arrived. The archaeological case for Shona origins is not, and never was, genuinely uncertain. Extensive excavation at the site has recovered Shona cultural artifacts throughout the layers of occupation. Radiocarbon dating has confirmed the construction timeline fits squarely within the period of Shona dominance in the region, and the broader archaeological context, the pottery styles, the layout of the settlement, the religious and ceremonial objects found at the site, all point clearly and consistently to an indigenous Shona origin, with no need for any outside builder. The suppression of this conclusion during the colonial period was political distortion, not scientific debate. What makes Great Zimbabwe particularly remarkable, once you look past the manufactured controversy over who built it, is what it reveals about the kingdom's reach. Excavations at the site have recovered Chinese porcelain, Persian pottery, and glass beads of Arab origin, physical evidence that the Kingdom of Zimbabwe was plugged into a trading network stretching across the Indian Ocean and as far as China. This level of long-distance commercial connection sits directly at odds with the colonial-era picture of pre-European African societies as isolated and disconnected from the wider world. The people living at Great Zimbabwe were trading partners with merchants from halfway across the globe, exchanging goods that moved along established routes, connecting southern Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, and ultimately East Asia. The wealth that supported this trade likely came substantially from gold and ivory, resources available in the region that were highly valued in the Indian Ocean trading networks. Great Zimbabwe's position allowed it to control and benefit from the movement of these goods toward the coast, where they would be picked up by Arab and later Portuguese traders for onward shipment. Gold mining sites associated with the kingdom have been identified across a wide area of the surrounding region, suggesting Great Zimbabwe sat at the center of an extraction and trading network that covered a considerable territory. This put the Shona kingdom at the center of a commercial system with genuinely global reach for its time, a fact that the colonial narrative worked hard to obscure. Even with the question of who built Great Zimbabwe long since settled, real questions about the site remain open. The precise political and religious structure of the Zimbabwe kingdom is not fully understood, and researchers continue to debate exactly how power was organized and exercised within the state. Some evidence points toward a sacred kingship model, where the ruler held both political and religious authority, with the hill complex potentially serving as the center of religious practice, separate from the more secular functions carried out elsewhere on the site. The specific function of the Great Enclosure itself has also been the subject of ongoing study. Earlier interpretations tended to assume it served primarily as a defensive fortification, given its scale and the strength of its walls. More recent archaeological work has shifted toward an interpretation of the Great Enclosure as a royal court or ceremonial space, possibly connected to rites of succession, royal residence, or important state ceremonies, rather than a structure built primarily for defense. A distinctive conical tower within the enclosure, solid and without any internal chamber, has been the subject of particular debate, with some researchers suggesting it may have had a religious or symbolic function connected to fertility or grain storage, though its precise purpose has never been conclusively established. The reasons behind Great Zimbabwe's eventual decline, beginning sometime around the 15th century, are also not fully resolved. Several factors have been proposed, including the depletion of local resources needed to sustain the population, environmental changes affecting agriculture and grazing land in the surrounding region, and shifts in trade routes that may have reduced the kingdom's commercial advantage as new powers and pathways emerged in the regional trading network, including the rise of other Shona states further north. None of these explanations has been definitively confirmed as the primary cause, and it is likely that some combination of factors contributed to the gradual decline of a city that had been the dominant power in the region for several centuries. Ongoing archaeological work at Great Zimbabwe continues to refine understanding of the site's chronology and the daily life of the people who lived there. Each new excavation season adds detail to a picture that, while no longer obscured by the politically motivated theories of the colonial era, still has genuine gaps. The wall remains standing, fitted together without mortar exactly as it was over 600 years ago, a structure that took considerable skill and labor to build, and that for far too long had its true history denied by the very people studying it. In the canyons and mesas of the American Southwest, there are entire cities carved into cliff faces, abandoned so suddenly that pottery was left on shelves and tools were left where they were last used. The people who built them did not simply move away over time. Within a few decades, they were gone, and the homes they left behind have been sitting largely untouched for over 700 years. The people responsible are known today as the Ancestral Puebloans, a name that replaced the older term Anasazi as the modern Pueblo descendant communities understandably preferred to be connected to their ancestors through a name rooted in their own languages, rather than one borrowed from Navajo, which is what Anasazi actually translates from. The Ancestral Puebloans occupied the Four Corners region, the area where the modern states of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, from roughly 100 AD through to 1300 AD. Over that span of more than 1,000 years, they built some of the most striking architecture found anywhere in pre-Columbian North America, including the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, the massive great houses of Chaco Canyon, and the canyon settlements of Canyon de Chelly. Chaco Canyon, in particular, represents an extraordinary achievement. The great houses built there, multi-story stone structures containing hundreds of rooms, required enormous quantities of timber, hauled from forests dozens of miles away, precise architectural planning, and a level of social organization capable of coordinating construction projects on that scale. Chaco functioned as a major regional center, connected to dozens of outlying communities through a network of roads that radiated out across the landscape in remarkably straight lines, some running for many miles, regardless of the terrain they crossed. Then, between roughly 1250 and 1300 AD, it all stopped. Across the entire Four Corners region, communities that had occupied their settlements for generations, in some cases for centuries, packed up and left. This was not a slow decline played out over many lifetimes. The archaeological evidence points to a relatively rapid and widespread withdrawal, happening within a window of just a few decades. What makes the abandonment so puzzling is what was left behind. Pottery, tools, and in some cases stored food supplies were found still in place by later archaeologists, as though people had simply walked away, rather than packing up everything they owned for a planned and orderly move. This creates a strange situation for researchers. The physical record is extraordinarily detailed, preserving an enormous amount of information about daily life, right up until the point of departure. But it does not clearly explain why people left possessions behind that they would presumably have wanted to take with them if circumstances had allowed. The most widely accepted explanation involves drought. Tree ring data from the region, which provides a remarkably precise year-by-year record of rainfall patterns going back centuries, shows that the Four Corners experienced a severe and sustained drought between approximately 1276 and 1299. This period, often referred to as the Great Drought, would have placed enormous pressure on agricultural communities dependent on reliable rainfall to grow corn, beans, and squash in an already marginal desert environment. But drought alone does not fully explain what happened. The ancestral Puebloans had lived in this region for over 1,000 years before the Great Drought, and the tree ring record shows they had weathered previous serious droughts during that time without abandoning their settlements completely. Something about the late 1200s combined drought with other pressures in a way that earlier dry periods had not produced. One of those additional pressures was violence. Excavations at several sites, including Sand Canyon Pueblo in southwestern Colorado, have uncovered skeletal remains showing clear evidence of trauma consistent with conflict, and in some cases, what researchers have described as massacre. A study published in the journal American Antiquity in 2015 documented evidence of violence at multiple sites dating to the final decades before abandonment, painting a picture of a region under serious social stress in the years leading up to the final withdrawal. Competition for increasingly scarce resources as the drought intensified is the most commonly proposed explanation for this rise in conflict, with communities turning on each other as the margin for survival narrowed. Some researchers have proposed that what happened in the Four Corners during this period represents something broader than drought and violence considered separately. The theory holds that ancestral Puebloan society experienced a genuine social and political collapse, in which the hierarchical structures that had organized large communities like Chaco Canyon broke down under the combined weight of environmental stress, conflict, and resource depletion. Once the systems that had coordinated trade, labor, and resource sharing across the region stopped functioning effectively, the argument goes, the underlying logic that had kept people in these specific locations for so long simply fell apart, making relocation the only viable option for communities trying to survive. What is not in dispute is where the people went. The descendant communities of the ancestral Puebloans are very much still here, living today as the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, including the Hopi, the Zuni, and the communities of the Rio Grande Pueblos, such as Taos, Acoma, and others. These are not lost peoples whose fate is unknown. Their oral traditions describe the movement away from the Four Corners region not as a desperate flight from catastrophe, but as a series of deliberate migrations, often connected to spiritual and prophetic narratives about the journey their ancestors were meant to undertake to find their eventual homes. This framing, coming directly from the descendant communities themselves, sits in an interesting tension with the archaeological evidence of drought and violence, suggesting that the lived experience and cultural memory of the migration may have been understood very differently by the people going through it than the purely environmental and conflict-driven narrative that the physical evidence alone might suggest. What remains genuinely unresolved is how all of these factors actually fit together. Researchers generally agree that drought, violence, and social strain all played some role, but the relative weight of each factor, and whether the abandonment was a single coordinated response to a shared crisis or a series of separate decisions made independently by different communities facing their own local pressures, is not settled. The archaeological record shows the what with remarkable clarity: the buildings, the pottery, the skeletal evidence, the tree ring data. What it cannot fully recover is the lived experience of those final decades, what it actually felt like to be a Pueblo community in the 1280s or 1290s, watching the rains fail, watching neighbors turn into rivals over scarce resources, and eventually deciding that the home your family had lived in for generations was no longer somewhere you could stay. Every civilization has its centers of power. Sometimes that power belongs to a king. Sometimes it belongs to a general. In ancient Egypt, for well over 1,000 years, a significant amount of it belonged to a temple and to the priests who ran it. The temple complex at Karnak, on the east bank of the Nile near modern Luxor, was the religious heart of ancient Egypt for more than 2,000 years. Dedicated primarily to the god Amun, it was expanded continuously by one pharaoh after another, from the Middle Kingdom all the way through to the Ptolemaic period, each ruler adding new pylons, halls, and shrines to a complex that grew larger and more elaborate with every passing dynasty. By the time it reached its full extent, Karnak covered an area large enough to hold several cathedrals, making it one of the largest religious complexes ever built anywhere in the ancient world. What ran inside Karnak was not just religious ritual. It was a genuine center of political and economic power. The priesthood of Amun accumulated land, gold, livestock, and influence across centuries, to the point where during certain periods of Egyptian history, the high priests of Amun effectively governed Upper Egypt in their own right, independent of whoever happened to be sitting on the throne in the north. During the Third Intermediate Period, a time of significant political fragmentation in Egypt, the high priesthood at Thebes functioned as a parallel power structure to the official pharaonic line, controlling territory, commanding resources, and exercising authority that in earlier periods would have belonged exclusively to the king. How this institution managed to maintain and even expand its power across some of the most turbulent centuries in Egyptian history is one of the more interesting and less discussed questions in Egyptology. Egypt went through foreign conquest, internal collapse, civil war, and dramatic religious upheaval over the centuries that the Karnak priesthood operated, and through most of it, the institution not only survived, but frequently grew stronger. The most dramatic test of that resilience came during the reign of Akhenaten, when Akhenaten dismantled the traditional pantheon and declared that Egypt would worship a single deity, the sun disk known as the Aten. The temples of the old gods were closed, their priesthoods stripped of income and authority, and their properties redirected to support the new religion. For the priests of Amun at Karnak, this was as close to total institutional destruction as anything in their long history. Their temple was shut, their god was officially erased from public worship, their wealth and influence were gone. And yet when Akhenaten died, and his religious revolution was reversed within a generation, the Amun priesthood returned to power remarkably quickly. The temples reopened, the old rituals resumed, and within a relatively short period, the institution was functioning at something close to its former strength. How exactly this recovery happened, how the institutional knowledge, the trained personnel, and the social networks of the priesthood survived a period when their entire institution had officially ceased to exist, is not something the surviving records explain in detail. The priesthood seems to have weathered a complete shutdown of their religious and economic base and come back from it with surprising speed, which suggests a depth of organizational resilience that the historical sources do not fully capture. Within the Karnak complex, the sacred lake stands as one of the more intriguing features whose full significance is only partly understood. This large rectangular body of water, built specifically for the temple, was used for ritual purification ceremonies that took place daily as part of the ongoing religious life of the complex. Priests performing temple duties were required to undergo purification rituals involving the lake before they could carry out their functions, and the lake also played a role in specific festivals throughout the year. Surviving texts and temple reliefs give some sense of how the lake was used, but the complete picture of the daily ceremonial life that took place around it has not been fully reconstructed from the available sources. One of the more politically significant roles connected to Karnak was the position known as the god's wife of Amun. This was a priestly office held by a woman, typically a royal daughter, who served as the symbolic consort of the god Amun in temple ritual. During the late period of Egyptian history, the god's wife of Amun became an extraordinarily powerful figure in Thebes, wielding religious authority that in some respects rivaled that of the pharaoh himself in the southern part of the country. The position was typically passed down through a specific succession process, often involving the adoption of a chosen successor by the current office holder, creating a chain of religious authority that operated somewhat independently of the usual rules of royal succession. The political maneuvering involved in securing this position for a particular family's daughter, and the influence that successive gods' wives exercised over religious and political life in Thebes, represents a chapter of Egyptian history that has received considerably less popular attention than the more familiar stories of pharaohs and queens. One of the most significant archaeological discoveries connected to Karnak came in 1803, when workers uncovered a massive buried cache beneath the temple courtyard. Inside were over 700 stone statues and an extraordinary 17,000 bronze figurines, an enormous accumulation of religious objects that had been deliberately placed in a pit and covered over at some point in the temple's long history. The statues span a considerable range of periods, suggesting they were gathered from across the temple complex over a long span of time before being buried together. Why this burial took place, who organized it, and what specific event or decision prompted the temple authorities to bury such an enormous quantity of religious material has never been established. The most common explanation is that the statues were cleared from the temple grounds during a renovation or reorganization at some point, and ceremonially buried rather than destroyed or discarded, since damaging sacred objects would have been considered inappropriate even when they were no longer in active use. But the specific circumstances surrounding this particular burial on this particular scale remain unclear. Excavation work at Karnak has continued for well over a century and shows no sign of slowing down. The Franco-Egyptian Center for the Study and Restoration of Karnak Temples has been conducting ongoing archaeological work at the site, continuing to uncover new structures, inscriptions, and objects that steadily add to the picture of how the temple functioned across its 2,000-year operational history. Given the sheer scale of Karnak and the length of time it was in continuous use, researchers generally expect that significant discoveries will continue to emerge from the site for a long time to come, each one adding another layer to the story of an institution that for over 2 millennia sat at the center of religious and political power in ancient Egypt. In 1929, a farmer in Sichuan province was repairing a ditch near his field when he uncovered a collection of jade and stone objects buried in the ground. He had no way of knowing it at the time, but he had stumbled onto the edge of one of the strangest archaeological sites ever found in China, one that would not reveal its full scale for another 57 years. Large-scale excavation at the site, now known as Sanxingdui, did not begin until 1986. When it did, workers uncovered 2 large sacrificial pits packed with objects unlike anything else found in Chinese archaeology. Bronze masks of enormous size, with eyes that did not just bulge, but extended outward on cylindrical stalks, in some cases projecting up to 16 centimeters beyond the face. Standing human figures cast in bronze, nearly 2.5 meters tall, dressed in elaborate robes and standing in stiff, formal poses. A bronze tree, almost 4 meters in height, covered in branches, birds, and decorative elements, elephant tusks, gold objects, jade artifacts, and burned animal bones, suggesting the pits were connected to ritual sacrifice of some kind. The discovery made international headlines at the time, and it has continued making headlines ever since. Between 2020 and 2022, archaeologists using updated excavation methods uncovered 6 additional pits at the site. These new excavations produced thousands more objects, including a gold mask, additional bronze vessels, and for the first time at Sanxingdui, fragments of silk. The scale of these newer discoveries confirmed something that researchers had suspected for years. The original 1986 finds, as extraordinary as they were, represented only a small fraction of what the site actually contains. What makes Sanxingdui such a genuine puzzle is not just the strangeness of the objects, but their isolation. The culture that produced these bronzes existed in Sichuan at roughly the same time the Shang dynasty was ruling over the Yellow River Valley to the north, one of the most important and well-documented early Chinese civilizations. The Shang are known for their sophisticated bronze casting, their oracle bone inscriptions, and their role as a foundational dynasty in Chinese history. Sanxingdui produced bronze objects on a scale and with a level of skill that rivals or exceeds anything coming out of Shang territory at the same time. And yet the styles, the techniques, and the religious imagery at Sanxingdui have almost nothing in common with what was being produced in the Shang heartland. This is not a minor stylistic difference. Shang bronzes are predominantly ritual vessels, decorated with specific motifs that fit within a well-understood religious and artistic tradition connected to ancestor worship and ceremonial feasting. Sanxingdui bronzes include enormous masks with grotesquely exaggerated features, freestanding human figures of a kind not found in Shang territory, and a bronze tree that does not correspond to anything in the broader Chinese bronze tradition of the period. 2 cultures existing at the same time within the same broad region of the world developed bronze casting traditions that look almost entirely unrelated to each other. Part of the explanation lies in geography. Sichuan sits behind significant mountain ranges that separate it from the Yellow River Basin where Shang civilization developed. In the 2nd millennium BC, before extensive road networks and organized long-distance travel connected the different regions of what would become China, this kind of geographic barrier could keep cultures developing along genuinely separate paths for centuries. The Sanxingdui culture may have evolved largely in isolation from the Shang world, drawing on its own religious traditions, its own artistic conventions, and its own understanding of how bronze should be worked and what it should represent, only later coming into more significant contact with the wider Chinese cultural sphere. The eyes are the detail that tend to capture the most attention, and for good reason. Across the Sanxingdui bronzes, eyes are consistently treated in an exaggerated, stylized way that does not appear in any other ancient artistic tradition anywhere in the world. Some masks have eyes that bulge outward from the face in dramatic curves. Others have eyes mounted on protruding cylindrical stalks that extend the feature well beyond the natural boundary of the face. What this represented in Sanxingdui religious belief has never been established with any confidence. Some researchers have proposed the eyes are a stylized representation of divine or supernatural sight, an artistic way of conveying that these figures could see things ordinary humans could not. Others have suggested a connection to local mythology involving figures with unusual physical characteristics, pointing to later Sichuan folklore that includes references to figures with protruding eyes. Whether any of these interpretations reflects what the Sanxingdui people actually believed, or whether the truth is something else entirely that has not survived in any form accessible to modern researchers, remains unresolved. Around 1000 BC, the Sanxingdui culture disappears from the archaeological record. The site was abandoned, and the distinctive bronze working tradition that had produced these extraordinary objects stops appearing in the historical sequence. A different material culture takes its place in the region in the centuries that follow, and the relationship between what came before and what came after is not well understood. Whether the population that had built Sanxingdui moved elsewhere, was absorbed into a different cultural group, or experienced some kind of collapse that ended their distinctive traditions, while the people themselves remained in the region under a changed cultural identity, is something the current evidence cannot settle. This pattern of a sophisticated culture appearing in the archaeological record, flourishing for a sustained period, and then disappearing without a clearly traceable successor, is something that connects Sanxingdui to other entries already covered in this video, and it remains one of the more persistent and unresolved threads running through ancient archaeology more broadly. The silk fragments found in the pits excavated between 2020 and 2022 add an important new dimension to the Sanxingdui story. This was the first confirmed evidence of silk found anywhere at the site, and its presence suggests connections to trade networks that had not previously been documented in connection with this culture. Silk production in ancient China is most strongly associated with regions further east and north, and finding silk fragments at Sanxingdui raises questions about how the culture was connected to broader trade and exchange networks across the region, networks that may have brought materials, techniques, or even ideas from considerably further afield than researchers had previously assumed, based on the earlier 1986 discoveries alone. Ongoing work at Sanxingdui continues, and given how much the 2020 to 2022 excavations added to the picture established by the original 1986 finds, researchers working at the site generally expect that further excavation will continue to reveal new objects and new information for years to come. Each new pit that has been opened has added complexity rather than resolution, deepening rather than answering the central questions about who the Sanxingdui people were, what their bronzes actually meant, and why a culture capable of producing objects this sophisticated simply stopped appearing in the historical record. When most people think of ancient empires in South America, they think of the Inca, and that makes sense. The Inca Empire was one of the largest in the world at the time of European contact, stretching for thousands of kilometers along the Andes and sustained by one of the most sophisticated administrative systems anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. But the Inca did not build that system from nothing. Several centuries before them, another empire had already covered much of the same territory, developed many of the same methods, and then collapsed so thoroughly that most people today have never heard of it. The Wari, sometimes spelled Huari, were a civilization that dominated the central Andes of what is now Peru from roughly 600 to 1000 AD. At their height, they controlled a territory stretching over 1,500 kilometers along the Andes, a reach that makes them the first empire-scale political organization in South American prehistory. They built administrative centers, established storage facilities, and developed road networks across a landscape that ranges from Pacific coastal desert to high-altitude grassland, some of the most demanding terrain on Earth to govern over long distances. Their capital city sat near what is now Ayacucho in central Peru. The site, also called Wari, covered approximately 20 square kilometers at its peak, a considerable urban footprint by any ancient standard. Population estimates for the city vary widely, with figures ranging from 10,000 to 70,000, depending on the methodology used and the period being assessed. But even the lower estimates would have made it one of the largest cities in the Americas during its time of operation. The remains of the city today include large enclosures, multi-story stone buildings, elaborate burial chambers, and evidence of craft production and long-distance trade operating at a significant scale. What the Wari are most interesting for, from a historical perspective, is the degree to which they prefigured what the Inca later built. The Inca road system, the state-run storage network known as the Colca, the practice of redistributing goods from central stores to maintain loyalty and supply across a diverse empire, all of these features that historians often credit to Inca ingenuity were already present in the Wari world centuries before the Inca rose to power. Whether the Inca inherited these systems directly from Wari precedents, whether they developed them independently after the Wari collapse, or whether both empires drew on even earlier Andean administrative traditions is an active area of debate that has not been resolved. The Inca had no memory of the Wari in their oral traditions, at least none that has been recorded, which suggests either that the connection was genuinely forgotten over the centuries between the two empires, or that the Inca chose not to acknowledge a predecessor. One of the most significant gaps in the Wari record is the absence of writing. The Wari were governing an empire of considerable complexity, coordinating labor, goods, and people across 1,500 kilometers of varied terrain, and doing all of this without a known writing system. The Inca managed the same challenge through the use of quipus, knotted string devices that encoded information through the arrangement, number, and color of knots. The Wari appear to have used a similar system, and examples of what researchers believe to be Wari quipus have been recovered from sites across their territory. But the Wari quipu system has not been deciphered. The information stored in those knots, potentially including administrative records, census data, tribute accounts, and historical information about the empire, is currently inaccessible. Until the Wari quipu system is cracked, the internal workings of the empire will remain largely invisible. Across the Wari Empire, a distinctive type of building appears at administrative centers. These are large structures with a D-shaped floor plan, a curved wall forming one side and a straight wall forming the other. They appear consistently enough across multiple sites that they are clearly a deliberate and standardized architectural form rather than a coincidence of local construction. What they were actually used for is not well understood. The size and quality of their construction points to an official function of some importance, and their consistent presence at administrative centers suggests a connection to the functioning of the state. Whether they were used for ceremonies, for feasting, for the storage of sacred objects, or for some other purpose specific to Wari institutional life, is a question that the archaeological evidence has not yet answered. The burial practices of the Wari have provided some of the most interesting recent evidence about the culture. Excavations at Huaca Pucllana in Lima, a large adobe platform mound that the Wari used as a burial site, have recovered elaborate burials, including wrapped mummy bundles accompanied by ceramic vessels, textiles, and other offerings. The quality and variety of the burial goods point to a stratified society with clear distinctions between elite and ordinary burials, consistent with the kind of hierarchical organization you would expect from an empire of this scale. New excavations at the Wari capital itself have also continued to add detail to the picture of how the city was laid out and how different areas within it functioned, though the overall picture of the empire's administrative structure remains incomplete. Around 1000 AD, the Wari Empire came apart. The cities were abandoned, the administrative network stopped functioning, and the archaeological record shows a shift to different material culture across a wide area. What caused the collapse is not known. Climate change has been proposed, with drought conditions affecting agricultural productivity across the Andean region during this period. Political fragmentation is another possibility, with the empire becoming too large and internally divided to hold together as central authority weakened. Conflict with outside groups or internal rebellion have also been suggested. Most likely, a combination of factors contributed, but the specific sequence of events that led from a functioning empire to widespread urban abandonment has not been reconstructed from the available evidence. The period between the Wari collapse around 1000 AD and the rise of the Inca around 1300 AD is one of the least documented stretches in Andean history. Regional powers came and went across the Andes during this interval, but none achieved the territorial reach of either the Wari or the Inca, and the historical and archaeological record for this period is considerably thinner than for the empires on either side of it. What happened to the people who had built and maintained the Wari world during those 3 centuries of post-collapse reorganization is a question that current research is only beginning to address. After the scale and complexity of the Wari Empire, this next entry is deliberately different. No cities, no administrative networks, no collapsed empires. Just a single rock formation in the desert of northwestern Saudi Arabia that looks like it was cut in half with a machine. Naslaa sits in the Tema Oasis region, a stretch of ancient landscape that has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. The formation consists of 2 large sandstone rocks, each one balanced on its own small natural pedestal, standing a short distance apart from each other. Between them runs a split so precise that it goes from top to bottom in a perfectly vertical line, with both faces of the gap being remarkably smooth and flat. When photographs of Naslaa began circulating widely online, the reaction was immediate. People could not work out how nature had done that. The Tema Oasis itself is not a place that tends to come up in popular history, but it should. This is one of the most historically rich locations in the Arabian Peninsula, a natural stopping point on trade routes that connected the ancient Near East to the Arabian interior and beyond. Tema has been continuously occupied since at least the 2nd millennium BC, and it turns up in records left by some of the major powers of the ancient world. Babylonian texts reference it. Assyrian inscriptions mention it. It appears in the Hebrew Bible. In the 6th century BC, the Babylonian king Nabonidus, the last ruler of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, left his capital and relocated to Tema for around a decade, a decision that has puzzled historians for a long time, given that he was abandoning the center of his empire in favor of an oasis in the Arabian desert. Whatever his reasons, the fact that a Babylonian king chose to spend 10 years there speaks to the significance of the location in the ancient world. The rock surfaces at Naslaa are covered in petroglyphs, carvings made into the stone that include human figures, animals, and geometric designs. These kinds of rock carvings are found across the Arabian Peninsula and represent one of the primary records of human activity in the region before written history. The petroglyphs at Naslaa point to the site having been used repeatedly over an extended period, with different people at different times, adding to the visual record on the stone. Whether the carvings have a ritual significance, serve as territorial markers, represent a form of communication, or simply record the presence of people who pass through the area is not something that can be definitively established from the images alone. The split itself is what draws most of the attention, running perfectly vertically through the formation with surfaces on both sides that are strikingly flat and smooth. The gap between the 2 sections of rock has prompted a wide range of explanations from people who have seen the photographs. The precision of the split, the fact that it appears to be a completely clean and even division rather than a rough natural break, is what makes it look artificial to most eyes. The natural assumption when looking at Naslaa is that something made that cut. Geologists studying the formation have pointed to several natural processes that can produce this kind of result in sandstone. Freeze-thaw weathering is one of the most commonly cited. Water from rainfall or condensation penetrates into a natural crack in the rock. When temperatures drop below freezing, that water expands as it turns to ice, widening the crack slightly. Over many cycles of freezing and thawing, across potentially thousands of years, the crack can be gradually forced open into a clean and even gap. The desert regions of the Arabian Peninsula do experience cold nights and temperature variations significant enough for this process to operate, even though the region is typically thought of in terms of heat rather than cold. Tectonic movement along a natural fault line in the rock is another geological explanation that has been proposed, and erosion by wind-driven sand along a pre-existing crack in the stone is a further possibility. All of these processes are well documented, and any of them could, under the right conditions, produce a split of the kind seen at Naslaa. The pedestals add another layer to the visual strangeness of the formation. Each section of the split rock balances on a small base of harder stone that has resisted erosion more effectively than the surrounding material, leaving the main rocks elevated slightly above the ground level on natural supports. The combination of the elevated position, the balanced appearance, and the clean split between the two sections creates a visual effect that looks deliberate in a way that stops people in their tracks. What makes this genuinely interesting from an archaeological perspective is not the split itself, which most geologists are comfortable attributing to natural processes, but the complete absence of formal investigation of the surrounding area. No excavation has been conducted at the site to the standard that would establish a full picture of what human activity has taken place there over the centuries. The petroglyphs demonstrate that people were present and engaged with this specific location over a long period, but the relationship between those people, the carvings they left, and the rock formation itself has never been properly studied. Tema has received archaeological attention as a historically significant site, but Naslaa specifically has not been the subject of the kind of systematic excavation and survey that would allow researchers to build a comprehensive account of its history. The oasis context matters here. Tema was not a remote or marginal location in the ancient world. It was a known and valued stopping point on significant trade routes, visited by merchants, travelers, and at one point a Babylonian king who apparently liked it enough to stay for a decade. A visually striking rock formation at such a location, covered in petroglyphs, would have been a notable landmark for anyone passing through. Whether that landmark carried ceremonial, spiritual, or simply navigational significance to the people who carved those figures into its surface is a question that the current state of research at the site cannot answer. Naslaa is also a reminder that not every ancient mystery requires a lost civilization or a suppressed discovery. Sometimes the puzzle is simpler, a rock split in a way that looks like it should not have happened naturally, sitting in one of the most historically significant oases in the Arabian world, covered in carvings made by people whose relationship to this specific place has never been fully investigated. The geological explanation for the split is plausible. The full story of what this site meant to the people who kept coming back to carve into its surface is not yet known. About 30 kilometers south of Rome, in the hills of the Castelli Romani, there is a small lake sitting in the crater of an ancient volcano. It is called Lake Nemi, and for centuries it held a secret that everyone knew about, but nobody could reach. Local people, fishermen, and divers had been aware since at least the 15th century that there were enormous ancient structures on the lake bed. Objects had been pulled up from the water over the years, bronze fittings, decorative elements, fragments of what was clearly something significant. But the lake was deep. The technology to reach what was down there did not exist. And for centuries, the Nemi ships remained exactly where they had sunk, roughly 1,500 years earlier. In the 1930s, Mussolini decided to change that. He ordered a large-scale drainage operation, partially lowering the lake level to expose the lake bed and recover whatever was there. Between 1929 and 1932, 2 ships emerged from the mud. They were not warships. They were not cargo vessels. They were floating palaces built for the Roman Emperor Caligula, who reigned from 37 to 41 AD. And what they contained when they came out of the water genuinely surprised the engineers and archaeologists who worked on them. Caligula is one of the most infamous figures in Roman history, though the extent to which the ancient sources exaggerate his cruelty and eccentricity has been debated by historians for a long time. The writers who described his reign most vividly, Suetonius and Cassius Dio, were writing long after his death, and drew on sources that were not necessarily reliable or impartial. What is not in doubt is that Caligula was emperor for only 4 years before being assassinated by members of his own Praetorian Guard, and that his reign was marked by an approach to imperial resources that even by the standards of Roman emperors was considered excessive. The Nemi ships fit that picture entirely. The larger of the two was approximately 70 meters long and 20 meters wide, a size comparable to a significant modern vessel. Both ships were fitted with marble floors, heated baths, and decorative bronze fittings of extremely high quality. There were rotating statues. There was running water delivered through lead pipe systems. The level of luxury represented on both ships was, by any measure, extraordinary. But it was the technology found on the ships that really caught researchers off guard. Among the recovered fittings were examples of engineering that had not previously been confirmed as existing in the ancient Roman world. Sophisticated bilge pumps, more complex than anything previously documented from the period. Ball bearings, the small spherical components used to reduce friction in rotating mechanisms, which most historians had assumed were a much more recent development. Prefabricated lead pipe fittings, produced in a standardized format that pointed to an organized manufacturing process, rather than one-off craft production. The recovery of these objects forced a reassessment of what Roman craftsmen in the 1st century AD were actually capable of, and raised questions about whether other examples of advanced Roman engineering had simply not survived or not yet been found. The purpose of the ships has never been definitively established. Lake Nemi was the site of a famous sanctuary dedicated to the goddess Diana, one of the most significant religious sites in the region around Rome, and some researchers have proposed that the ships functioned as floating temples connected to that sanctuary. The ceremonies associated with the Diana cult at Nemi were unusual and well documented, including a ritual involving a priest-king who held his position by killing his predecessor and could in turn be challenged and killed by any escaped slave who could break off a branch from a sacred tree within the sanctuary. Whether the ships played a direct role in these rituals, served as venues for imperial ceremonies of a different kind, or simply represented Caligula's personal preference for extreme luxury on water, is not something the physical evidence settles clearly. After their recovery from the lake, both ships were housed in a purpose-built museum constructed at the Nemi site. For around a decade, they were one of the most remarkable archaeological displays in Italy, giving researchers and visitors direct access to 2 of the best preserved large Roman vessels ever found. Then, in May 1944, the museum caught fire. Both ships were destroyed. The circumstances of the fire have been disputed from the moment it occurred and have never been conclusively resolved. The most widely repeated account blames retreating German forces, who were moving through the area at the time and who some witnesses reported seeing near the museum before the fire started. Other accounts have suggested Allied bombing in the vicinity may have been responsible, or that the fire was started by looters who had been taking artifacts from the museum during the chaos of the wartime occupation. Whatever actually started it, the fire burned through the museum and took both ships with it. What had survived 1,500 years at the bottom of a lake was gone within a night. What remains is considerable, but incomplete. Before the destruction, extensive measurements, drawings, photographs, and plaster casts had been made of both ships, preserving a detailed record of their construction and layout. A number of artifacts recovered from the ships before the fire, bronze fittings, decorative elements, examples of the engineering components that had drawn such attention, survive in collections at the National Roman Museum and the museum at Nemi itself, which was rebuilt after the war. These objects are enough to confirm the extraordinary nature of what was lost, but they are not the same as having the ships themselves. The lakebed at Nemi has never been fully excavated. The 1930s drainage operation recovered the 2 large ships, but did not conduct a comprehensive survey of the surrounding area. Underwater surveys carried out in more recent decades have found evidence of additional structures and objects on the lakebed that were not recovered during the original operation, pointing to the possibility that Caligula's activities at Nemi were more extensive than the 2 ships alone suggest. What exactly is still sitting on the bottom of that volcanic crater lake, and what it might tell researchers about what Caligula was doing there, is a question that no excavation has yet fully addressed.